Welcome to the exploration of the ancient Khmer civilization. Angkor, the forgotten empire of the gods. Have you ever wondered why the world's largest religious monument isn't found in Rome, Cairo, or even Jerusalem, but deep within the tangled jungles of Cambodia, hidden behind thick canopies where sunlight struggles to reach the moss-covered stones, lies a lost empire whose scale once rivaled ancient Rome and whose spiritual ambition reached for the gods themselves. The Khmer Empire, once the heartbeat of Southeast Asia, stretched across what is now Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, and southern Vietnam, yet its capital vanished for centuries beneath vines and silence. What could cause such a mighty civilization to rise to breathtaking heights, only to fall so quietly that the world almost forgot it existed? This is not just a story of kings and temples. This is a story of memory, of mystery, and of what time chooses to keep hidden. Today, Angkor Wat is a symbol of national pride, appearing on Cambodia's flag, visited by millions, and photographed in golden dawns. But few realize that Angkor is just the visible surface of something far greater, a megacity spread over 1,000 square kilometers, built stone by stone without the help of steel or mortar. Its water reservoirs were so vast some could rival the size of modern lakes. Its roads, canals, temples, and towers whispered a language of cosmic harmony, an empire aligned not just to seasons, but to heaven. Who were the people that built it? What did they believe, and why, despite all their brilliance, did they vanish? To understand the Khmer Empire, we must travel far beyond stone ruins and weathered bas-reliefs. We must enter a world where kings declared themselves gods, where water was more powerful than fire, and where architecture served as a cosmic map. This empire wasn't merely built, it was imagined. Every sandstone block of Angkor Wat, every smiling face on the towers of Bayon, carries not just weight but meaning. What we see now are remnants, but once they were living prayers carved into the earth. And behind these stones were engineers, dancers, monks, warriors, rice farmers, all playing their role in a complex world we're only beginning to rediscover. This is not your average historical documentary. We won't be counting bricks or reading dry inscriptions. We'll be walking with the ghosts of Angkor. You'll hear their echoes through dried-up moats and long-abandoned roads. You'll feel the heartbeat of the ancient city as we reconstruct it, not in pixels, but in perspective. What does it mean to create something meant to last forever, and yet watch it be taken by time, tree roots, and forgetfulness? These are not just ruins, they're questions turned into stone. In the next 3 hours, we'll dive deep into the rise and fall of the Khmer Empire, from its sacred origins and cosmic temples, to the daily rhythms of its people, and the collapse that left only shadows. Along the way, you'll discover secrets hidden in temple walls, forgotten waterways that once sustained an entire civilization, and kings whose ambitions outshone their armies. But most importantly, you'll gain a sense of awe, not just for what was built, but for what remains. Because the Khmer Empire isn't just ancient history, it's a mirror. And what we see reflected back might just be something about ourselves. So take a deep breath. The jungle is thick, but the path is open. The stones are silent, but they still speak. Step with us into the lost heart of Angkor. The gods may have left, but the stories, they are waiting.
Before it was a ruin, it was a secret.
There was a time when Angkor was not a destination, but a myth. For centuries, tales of a magnificent city swallowed by the jungle were whispered along trade routes mentioned in Chinese scrolls and dismissed as fantasy by colonial explorers. Locals spoke of temples overgrown with trees, of stone towers where spirits still lingered, and of roads paved not for men, but for gods. Yet for the modern world, the Khmer Empire remained elusive, a memory too faint to be believed. That is, until someone looked down from the sky. In 2007, a team of archaeologists and remote sensing experts conducted an aerial survey over northwest Cambodia. Equipped with LiDAR light detection and ranging technology, they aimed laser pulses through the dense forest canopy. What returned wasn't just data, it was revelation. Beneath the greenery, the outlines of entire cities emerged, grid-like streets, canals, dikes, reservoirs, and hidden temples, all once part of a complex urban sprawl that had been completely invisible from the ground. What had seemed like isolated ruins were now seen as fragments of a colossal metropolis. Imagine flying above the jungle in silence, the morning mist is still clinging to the treetops. At first you see only green, a sea of leaves and shadow. But then as your instruments calibrate, the foliage fades away and geometry takes its place, straight lines where nature does not grow, square voids where no tree should stand, and roads that vanish into the horizon. You are not just looking at ruins. You are looking at a city lost in time, perhaps the largest pre-industrial urban complex on Earth. The most iconic of these temples is, of course, Angkor Wat. From above, its lotus-shaped towers pierce the canopy like spires of a forgotten religion. But LiDAR revealed that Angkor Wat was only a small node in a much larger system. Surrounding it were hundreds of lesser-known temples, palaces, ceremonial causeways, and vast water reservoirs called barays. Each of them aligned not randomly but purposefully, facing celestial points reflecting cosmological beliefs. This was not a city built for convenience. It was built to mirror the universe. And then there is Mahendra Parvata, the holy mountain city. Long rumored to exist on Phnom Kulen, the sacred mountain to the north, Mahendra Parvata had resisted exploration for years due to thick vegetation and dangerous terrain. But LiDAR stripped the land bare, and what it found was astonishing: a grid-based city with complex infrastructure, temples previously unknown to scholars, and clues pointing to this being one of the earliest capitals of the Khmer Empire. Long before Angkor Wat dominated the skyline, Mahendra Parvata may have been the cradle of Khmer kingship. What makes these discoveries even more incredible is how little remains visible to the naked eye. On the ground, many of these structures appear as no more than humps of earth disguised by roots and fallen leaves. The jungle does not simply overgrow, it devours. Entire walls crumble under the weight of centuries, temples collapse under strangler figs, and inscriptions are worn down by rain, wind, and silence. Without aerial imaging, we might never have realized that the forest was hiding cities, plural, not just temples. To grasp the scale of this hidden world picture, a city the size of modern-day Los Angeles but built without concrete, glass, or electricity. It was a city where water flowed through engineered canals, where temples functioned as both spiritual and civic centers, and where every architectural choice carried religious meaning. Unlike other ancient metropolises that expanded chaotically, Angkor's layout was deeply planned. It embodied Hindu and later Buddhist cosmology, especially the sacred Mount Meru and the churning ocean of milk. This was urban design guided not by economics, but by the heavens. From the air, you can trace the old roads, long straight arteries of the empire, some stretching for miles across jungle and plain. These were the superhighways of their time, connecting Angkor to distant provinces, to the Mekong, to what is now Laos and Vietnam. Some were flanked by Naga balustrades, serpent guardians carved in stone. Others passed over ancient bridges with smiling Buddhas and mythic scenes carved into every inch. These roads weren't just for trade. They were symbols of imperial power carved into the land as declarations of divine order. And then there's the water. From above, the vast barays appear like giant rectangles etched into the jungle, many still filled with water centuries later. The largest of these, the West Baray, is over 8 kilometers long and 2 kilometers wide. No other ancient civilization created such monumental reservoirs with such precision. These were not just for irrigation. They represented the cosmic ocean part of a spiritual blueprint where kings played the role of Vishnu, creator and sustainer. In Angkor, infrastructure was mythology. Perhaps the most poetic revelation from these skyward discoveries is this: even in their silence, the temples still form a dialogue. They speak to each other through alignment and distance. One temple's eastern gate opens in line with another's western threshold. Central towers rise at precise angles to equinoxes and solstices. It's as if the entire city was orchestrated as a grand celestial instrument meant to be experienced from above, long before we had the means to do so. Did the builders know? Or were they dreaming of gods who watched from the sky? And yet, despite all this magnificence, most people know Angkor for just one view: sunrise over Angkor Wat, the reflection in the still pool, the silhouetted towers against golden sky. It is a beautiful image, yes, but also a narrow one. It hides the greater truth that Angkor was not a monument, but a world. A living, breathing civilization with temples as its bones, water as its blood, and belief as its soul. What LiDAR gave us was not just a map, it gave us a second chance to remember. As we continue this journey through the Khmer Empire, remember that what you see today, the tourist paths, the cleared courtyards, the reconstructed towers, is only a fragment. The real Angkor, the one built by thousands of hands and countless dreams, still lies just beyond the visible. It is written in roots and shadows and buried stones and skyborne echoes. And it is only just beginning to speak again. The word Angkor doesn't just name a place, it names a memory, a breath held in stone. Derived from the Sanskrit Nagara, meaning city, Angkor was never a single monument, but a vast living world. For centuries, that world faded behind vines, erased from maps, and swallowed by monsoon forests. Its roads turned to rivers, its inscriptions wore to dust, and yet its name survived in whispers. In the cracks between centuries, Angkor lingered like a heartbeat under the earth, waiting to be heard again. When European explorers first arrived in Cambodia during the colonial period, they couldn't believe what they saw. A sprawling temple complex that rivaled the pyramids of Giza, in scale carved with stories from Hindu epics, wrapped in the arms of banyan trees. One French naturalist, Henri Mouhot, famously described Angkor Wat as a structure that would rival that of Solomon erected by an ancient Michelangelo. But to the local people, this was not a lost city. It was never forgotten. They called it Vra Vishnulak, the sacred abode of Vishnu, and they had lived beside its stones for generations. The silence that the West perceived was never silence to the Cambodians. And yet the Angkor they knew was only part of a larger, older tale. As archaeologists began to peel back layers of earth and legend, they found that the name Angkor represented not one king, not one city, but 1,000 years of dynasties, temples, battles, and gods. It was the heart of the Khmer Empire, one of the most sophisticated and spiritually ambitious civilizations the world has ever seen. From the 9th to the 15th century, the Angkorian kings transformed jungle into geometry, water into cosmos, and kingship into something almost divine. The empire's reach extended across Southeast Asia, but its soul always circled back to Angkor. Beneath the roots of the strangler figs and the cracked laterite stones lies an epic that few modern visitors fully grasp. The monuments we see today are only the final chapters. Long before Angkor Wat rose to dominate the skyline, there were other capitals, other names: Hariharalaya, Yasodharapura, Mahendraparvata. Each bore witness to a different vision of Khmer greatness. Each was built not just for the living, but for eternity. The very stones were inscribed with prayers, treaties, and poetry, so that even if people forgot, the land would remember. To walk among the temples of Angkor is to walk inside a worldview. Each structure was not simply a building, it was a diagram of the universe. Towers represented the mythical Mount Meru, home of the gods. Moats and reservoirs symbolized the cosmic oceans. Terraces and corridors aligned with solstices and equinoxes. The carvings were more than decoration, they were scripture in stone. Here in these silent corridors, the Mahabharata and Ramayana unfold not on parchment, but on sandstone. Heroes with bows and 10-headed demons battle forever across the walls. This was not architecture. This was devotion made visible. Yet Angkor was never static. It grew, shifted, collapsed, and rebuilt itself with the changing tides of power, belief, and ambition. Under Jayavarman II, the Khmer Empire was declared sovereign and divinely ordained. Under Suryavarman II, Angkor Wat was constructed as a temple to Vishnu, the only major temple in the empire dedicated primarily to that deity. And then came Jayavarman VII, the Buddhist king who reshaped the spiritual identity of the land. He built Bayon with its smiling stone faces, and Taprum, where nature now shares the same roof as stone. His reign marked not just an expansion of territory, but a transformation of consciousness. Still, the name Angkor did not just mean glory, it also came to mean weight. The weight of managing vast water systems, of defending borders stretched thin, of maintaining divine order in a world of drought, flood, and invasion. As centuries passed, the temples remained, but the empire began to fracture. Thai armies approached from the west. The water stopped flowing as it once had. The inscriptions became fewer, and eventually the city emptied. The people moved on, but the temples did not. They stayed behind like sentinels of a forgotten age. When you stand at the gates of Angkor Thom today, you pass through a portal not just of stone, but of scale. The giant faces above the gates smile serenely, each one facing a cardinal direction. They are not simply statues, they are reminders that everything grand once stood here, that gods and kings shared the same walls, that elephants thundered down these avenues and monks chanted beneath these trees. The roots that now split the stones are not invaders, but caretakers holding history in place when memory wavers. The name Angkor also echoes through culture. It is more than geography, it is identity. For the Cambodian people, it is not just a past, it is a pulse. It survived colonization, war, and genocide. It returned on banknotes and school books and through pilgrimage. Every sunrise over Angkor Wat is not just a tourist photo, it's a quiet act of reclamation. A people telling the world we built this, and we are still here. The modern rediscovery of Angkor is also a story of imagination, of minds that looked at crumbling stone and saw cities, of scholars who followed clues through rice paddies, jungle paths, and ancient texts. But as this new lens grew sharper, so did the responsibility. For every drone image and satellite scan revealed not just structure, but silence. The silence of workers never named, of women rarely carved, of entire generations, whose fingerprints lie under every stone, but whose stories are not in books. Angkor is vast, but what we know is still small. And perhaps that is the power of the name, Angkor. It doesn't shout, it whispers, it humbles. It doesn't demand to be understood in one sitting, one documentary, or even one lifetime. It invites us to listen, to lean in, to look beyond the dramatic towers and see the fragments, a broken lintel still bearing the curl of a Naga tail, a sandstone block placed with perfect balance centuries ago, a tree root curling through a window like a hand reaching back in time. Even now, Angkor is not done revealing itself. In the last few decades alone, hundreds of undiscovered temples have been mapped, new inscriptions decoded, hidden cities found beneath rice fields, and still questions remain. Why did it fall? What was its true population? What knowledge have we already lost? These are not just questions for archaeologists. They are questions for all of us, for anyone who has ever wondered how something so magnificent could simply disappear. In the chapters to come, we will journey into the heart of that mystery. We'll explore how Angkor's cities were built, how its people lived, how its kings ruled, and why in the end its temples stood longer than its thrones. We'll examine the waters, the wars, the gods, and the ghosts. But always we'll carry one name with us, Angkor, a name that echoes not because it is loud, but because it has never stopped speaking.
No cement. No cranes. Yet they built something that still stuns the earth.
There are few places on Earth where stone seems to defy gravity, where it rises not as ruin, but as revelation. Angkor Wat is one of them. This is not simply a temple. It is a cosmic machine made of sandstone, assembled with no steel, no mortar, and no modern machinery. Its towers bloom like lotus buds, its galleries stretch like rivers, and its every angle reflects an understanding of time-space and divinity that still astonishes scholars today. The question is not just why it was built, but how. At its heart, Angkor Wat is a monument to vision, both sacred and logistical. Constructed in the early 12th century under King Suryavarman II, it was dedicated to the god Vishnu, breaking with the Shaivite tradition of previous Khmer rulers. But beyond its religious identity lies an architectural ambition almost unparalleled in pre-modern history. The scale is staggering, over 400 acres, with a central tower rising 65 meters above the ground. Its layout forms a giant mandala, a symbolic diagram of the universe with concentric galleries, massive moats, and precise axial alignments to solstices and equinoxes. To conceive it is one thing, to build it was another. The first challenge, the stone itself. Angkor Wat is primarily constructed from sandstone, not local laterite. And that sandstone came from a quarry nearly 40 kilometers away, atop the Kulin mountain range. This means that every block, some weighing up to 1.5 tons, had to be transported across rivers, forests, and muddy plains without the benefit of wheels, pulleys, or iron tools. Most likely, the Khmer engineers used a network of canals to float the stones downstream. The journey was long, wet, and delicate, yet the stones arrived not just intact, but beautifully shaped. There is no mortar between these stones. The Khmer builders practiced dry masonry, precision cutting each block to fit so tightly against the next that even air struggled to pass through. This required more than craftsmanship, it required mathematics. Measurements were made using traditional Khmer cubits, and the architects accounted for weight distribution, gravitational stress, and seasonal expansion. The fact that the structure still stands today virtually unmoved for 900 years is a quiet testament to their genius. Even the foundation was floated on sand and compacted laterite to buffer floods and seismic shifts. Inside Angkor Wat, the artistry deepens. Walls stretch for hundreds of meters, carved with bas-reliefs that seem impossibly fine, as though painted in stone. There are scenes from the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, and Khmer legends, churnings of oceans, heavenly battles, parades of warriors, and processions of celestial beings. These were not added later. The carving began as soon as each block was placed. It's estimated that over 300,000 laborers and 6,000 elephants were employed across the decades of construction. But to call them mere workers is to miss the truth. They were artists, visionaries, builders of the gods. Yet as grand as it is, Angkor Wat is not overwhelming. It's balanced. Every aspect, its width, height, and depth, is harmonized through symmetry. Its 5 towers represent the peaks of Mount Meru, the home of the gods in Hindu cosmology. The moat, over 190 meters wide, represents the cosmic ocean. Its long causeways are not merely paths, but ceremonial thresholds, a journey from the human realm into the divine. These spatial metaphors aren't hidden. They're lived. To walk Angkor is to move through the universe as the Khmer saw it. One of the most remarkable features of the temple is its orientation. Unlike most Khmer temples, which face east, Angkor Wat faces west. Scholars have long debated why. Some believe it was because Vishnu, the temple's patron deity, is associated with the west. Others suggest that Angkor Wat was also designed as a funerary temple for Suryavarman II, and west symbolizes death in Hindu cosmology. But recent studies suggest something more astronomical. The temple aligns with the equinoxes, and certain towers mark the passage of the sun in perfect sequence. It was quite literally a calendar in stone. The builders thought not just in space, but in light. During the spring equinox, the sun rises directly over the central tower when viewed from the western entrance. As the day progresses, light moves through the corridors, casting shadow patterns that echo the cycles of time and myth. This was no accident. The Khmer architects engineered light as part of the temple's breath. It's an architecture not just of mass, but of movement, of how the divine is revealed slowly through shadow and illumination. Construction likely took over 30 years, though some argue it may have extended into the reign of Suryavarman's successors. But unlike many great architectural feats of the ancient world, Angkor Wat was completed. There is little evidence of abrupt halts, missing stones, or unfinished galleries. The Khmer king saw temple building not as a single act of greatness, but as a duty to both gods and posterity. Each stone laid was a prayer, each carving a contract between earth and heaven. What tools did they use? Simple ones, chisels of bronze, or iron wooden mallets and measuring cords? And yet the results feel more precise than what modern machines sometimes achieve. The carving style, known as Angkor Wat style, is marked by elegance, smooth flow, and idealized human form. The Apsaras, celestial dancers etched into nearly every column, still smile with astonishing delicacy, their jewelry captured in stone with hypnotic rhythm. Some walls hold over 1,500 individual dancers, each unique, none repeated. This wasn't mass production. This was reverence. And still the temple changes with the weather. In the rainy season, the moat fills and reflects the entire complex in mirror-like perfection. During the dry season, the stones heat and shimmer. Moss grows in the shaded corners, and dragonflies sweep over the lotus ponds. Angkor Wat is not just enduring, it's alive. Its materials breathe with the rhythm of nature. Perhaps that is why it has lasted, not because it resists nature, but because it listens to her. From a distance, Angkor Wat looks eternal. But up close, you see the cracks, the erosion, the subtle tilt of towers burdened by centuries. And yet nothing has collapsed. The Khmer builders knew how to layer stone so it could flex without breaking to vent water, without weakening foundations to stack load with perfect balance. It's engineering disguised as myth, myth disguised as reality. Even today, when we speak of Angkor Wat, we still speak in partial truths. We can explain the canal routes, we can measure the quarries, but we cannot fully recreate the mind that imagined it all in the 12th century without blueprints, without cranes, and without global fame. They did not build Angkor Wat to impress the world. They built it to echo the divine. The fact that we are still speaking of it today means in some way they succeeded. As we leave this chapter, we carry with us more than technical admiration. We carry a kind of awe, not just for what the Khmer people built, but for how they saw the world. A world where stone could tell stories, where architecture was an act of faith, and where a temple was not just a place of worship, but a mirror of the universe itself. To truly understand Angkor Wat is to understand that it is not just a building, it is a map of the cosmos. Its walls are not merely boundaries, but symbolic borders between the earthly and the divine. Its towers do not just reach into the sky, they imitate sacred geography. And at its heart lies a concept that stretches back into the oldest spiritual traditions of India, Mount Meru, the cosmic mountain that sits at the center of the universe. Angkor Wat is not a temple about Meru. It is Meru rebuilt in stone, scaled for mortals, and designed to align the Khmer king with the order of the heavens. Mount Meru in Hindu and Buddhist cosmology is the axis mundi, the world axis. It is the central point of the universe around which the sun, moon, and stars revolve. It rises from the ocean of creation and is flanked by lesser peaks and floating continents. Gods dwell at its summit. Its base is surrounded by cosmic seas, its middle ranges by divine beings, and its slopes by demons and spirits. For ancient architects, recreating Meru on earth was not just symbolic, it was sacred duty. To build a temple in Meru's image was to affirm harmony between heaven, earth, and the king who governed both. Angkor Wat embodies this ideal in almost every architectural detail. Its 5 central towers represent the 5 peaks of Mount Meru, the tallest central spire being the summit. The outer gallery, the moat, and the enclosure walls represent the mountains and oceans that encircle Meru in Hindu and Buddhist cosmology. Every step inward brings the pilgrim or the king closer to the divine axis, to the symbolic center of the universe. Movement through the temple is not just spatial, it is spiritual. The act of entering Angkor Wat was designed to mirror a journey into cosmic truth. The dimensions themselves carry meaning. Angkor Wat is 1,500 meters long and 1,300 meters wide. The moat is over 190 meters across. These are not random figures. Scholars believe that the temple's measurements may encode calendrical and astronomical data aligning with solar cycles and lunar phases. The number of steps between galleries, the heights of certain tiers, the distances between towers, they all suggest an intentional cosmological message. Angkor Wat was not just a structure, it was an instrument of divine order carved into the land. And then there's orientation. As mentioned before, Angkor Wat uniquely faces west, an unusual direction in Khmer temple design. While some interpret this as symbolic of Vishnu, others view it as a funerary orientation for King Surya Varman II. But a deeper reading connects it with celestial balance. The setting sun, the west, represents transition, the passage from life to death, from one world to the next. Angkor Wat becomes a liminal space, a place between worlds, a cosmic corridor where light and shadow play out the stories of both time and eternity. This symbolic layering extends even into the smallest carvings. The bas reliefs that run along the outer galleries are not only decorative, they tell the great epics of ancient India, anchoring Khmer kingship within a divine lineage. The churning of the ocean of milk carved on a 49-meter panel shows devas and asuras, gods and demons, pulling the Naga serpent Vasuki to churn the primordial sea. This scene is not just myth. It's a metaphor for cosmic balance of chaos and order, destruction and renewal. And it mirrors the Khmer belief that their empire, like that cosmic sea, was maintained through divine alignment and human effort. At the center of the temple in the main tower stood the sanctuary, a sacred chamber where the divine presence was most concentrated. Access was once restricted, allowed only to kings, high priests, or certain elites. This was not merely political exclusivity, it was cosmological hierarchy. Just as Mount Meru's summit is accessible only to gods, the central tower of Angkor Wat embodied that celestial exclusiveness. Climbing to the uppermost level was both a privilege and a ritual, a symbolic ascent through the layers of the cosmos from the earthly to the eternal. Even the causeways are filled with meaning. The long raised walkways leading to Angkor Wat from the west are lined with Naga balustrades, seven-headed serpent guardians that stretch like cosmic bridges. In mythology, the Naga is the link between heaven and earth, between gods and mortals. To walk along these causeways was not just to approach a building, but to cross thresholds of time, of space, of perception. Each step was part of a larger ritual, a slow unfolding of meaning carved into every stone. The central sanctuary tower is shaped like a lotus bud, a symbol of purity, transcendence, and cosmic birth. The lotus rises from the murky waters, yet remains unstained. In Hinduism and Buddhism, it represents spiritual awakening, enlightenment, and detachment. That the Tower of Angkor Wat imitates this shape is no accident. It suggests that the temple is not just a place of worship, it is a symbol of spiritual blossoming. A reminder that even from the chaos of life, the soul can rise toward the light of divine truth. The visual symmetry of the temple also reflects deeper philosophical concepts. The Khmer were deeply influenced by Indian metaphysics, particularly ideas about duality and balance, male and female light, and dark, earthly and heavenly. The temple's perfect reflections in its surrounding waters hint at the illusory nature of reality. What is above is reflected below. In some ways, Angkor Wat doesn't just show the universe. It invites the viewer to question their place in it. Are we moving through stone, or is stone moving through us? The architects of Angkor Wat were not merely engineers, they were cosmologists. Their blueprint was the sky, their mathematics derived from rhythm, ritual, and myth. They built not for function, but for transformation. Every column, stairway, lintel, and doorway was meant to shift the consciousness of the visitor, to remind the king of his dharma, to remind the people of their connection to the sacred, and to remind everyone who entered that they were walking not through a monument, but through a model of existence itself. Even today, when drones rise above the jungle and reveal the full symmetry of Angkor Wat from the air, it's hard not to feel what the ancient builders must have imagined: a sense of awe at the mirror between heaven and earth. A temple that begins in mud and rises to meet the stars. A message across centuries carved not just to be seen, but to be felt. In its silence, Angkor Wat still whispers, "You are standing inside the center of everything." As we move forward in this journey, remember that what you've seen so far, the towers, the carvings, the causeways, is only the outer layer. The true meaning of Angkor lies in its invisible geometry, its celestial alignments, its spiritual grammar. To the Khmer building, a temple was not a political act. It was a cosmic offering, a way to keep the universe in balance. Stone can crack, fade, and fall, but words carved into it can still speak across the centuries. All around Angkor and across the former Khmer Empire, thousands of inscriptions remain etched into doorframes, pillars, towers, and pedestals. Some are grand declarations from kings, others are quiet offerings from commoners. They may look simple, neatly arranged lines in Sanskrit or Old Khmer, but these inscriptions were more than writing. They were prayers, contracts, messages to the gods and to the future. The Khmer did not use paper scrolls to record their great stories. They used stone. This wasn't just practicality, it was philosophy. Stone endures. And if a message was important enough, sacred enough, it deserved to be written into the bones of the temple itself. These inscriptions were not meant to be read and discarded. They were meant to last as long as the temple stood, to echo beyond the king's lifetime. and to tie his name forever to the divine order he sought to uphold. Many inscriptions begin in the same way, invoking the gods, especially Shiva, Vishnu, or Buddha depending on the period. Then they speak of the king, his virtues, victories, and divine right to rule. Titles multiply: the Lord of the World, Protector of Dharma, he who holds the wheel of time. But beyond the royal flattery lies something more revealing. The inscriptions tell us how temples were built, how land was donated, how workers were fed, and how rituals were maintained. These stones are not just monuments to power, they are blueprints of society. Take, for example, the Stele of Preah Khan, erected under King Jayavarman VII. It's over 2 meters tall, covered in more than 400 lines of text. It doesn't just glorify the king, it lists the names of over 10,000 officials, dancers, cooks, artisans, and monks who served the temple. It records how many oxen robes and gold bowls were donated. It even mentions the taxes waived for temple workers. In a world where few ordinary people left their mark here in this sacred document, their names remain. This was not just a holy space, it was a living community. Some inscriptions offer glimpses into personal devotion. A merchant dedicates a statue to his mother. A woman donates a rice field to feed monks during the rainy season. A soldier prays for protection before heading into battle. These are not grand royal proclamations. They are human voices, humble, hopeful, and haunting. And they remind us that behind the towering temples were people with lives as complex and uncertain as our own. These voices did not speak loudly, but they spoke sincerely. And Stone listened. The language of the inscriptions also carries meaning. Many were written in Sanskrit, the language of gods, ritual, and high scholarship. But others were in Old Khmer, the everyday tongue of the people. The use of both languages in the same temple reveals a dual purpose: to speak to the heavens and to be understood on earth. Kings addressed the gods with Sanskrit verses, but when they needed to ensure temple lands were respected or workers obeyed, they switched to Khmer. It was a system of layered communication, just like the temples themselves. What's more, the script itself was an art form. Curving, graceful, and meticulously carved, the letters dance across stone like embroidery. Scribes and artisans work closely, one composing the sacred words, the other etching them with precision and patience. Mistakes were rare. In some temples, the letters are so perfect they appear printed, not carved. In others, faint guidelines are still visible, pencil-thin grooves to help the chisel stay true. These were not casual inscriptions. They were sacred acts of creation. But the messages weren't only for gods or contemporaries. They were also warnings. Let no one disturb this land, one reads. Let those who harm this temple be cursed by Shiva and reborn a worm. Another lists the consequences of disrespecting monks or stealing offerings: misfortune, illness, eternal wandering. These were moral codes, legal threats, and spiritual boundaries, all carved in public view. In a world without police or permanent law courts, the temple inscription became a pillar of justice. And yet some of the most poignant inscriptions are unfinished. A line trails off mid-sentence. A chisel mark ends abruptly. In these silences, we glimpse disruption, perhaps the death of the scribe, or the fall of a dynasty, or the onset of war. The gaps speak as loudly as the words. They remind us that even empires are subject to interruption, that even the stone can be silenced, but they also whisper resilience, because even broken, the message survives. Over time, the meaning of many inscriptions was lost. As the Khmer Empire declined and Buddhism took deeper root, the language of Sanskrit faded from daily use. Scripts changed, pronunciations shifted. Eventually, many locals could no longer read the words their ancestors had carved. The stones remained, but their voices grew faint. For centuries, monks swept the courtyards, tourists wandered the halls, and rain streaked the ancient letters. Few knew what the walls were saying. It wasn't until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that scholars began decoding them again. French epigraphers like Etienne Emonier and Georges Cadet studied thousands of inscriptions, piecing together the lost history of the Khmer kings. Their work became the backbone of modern understanding of Angkor. Through these texts, we learn the names of forgotten monarchs, the dates of temple constructions, and the shifting tides of political alliances. Without the inscriptions, Angkor would be just architecture. With them, it becomes a story. Even now, many stones remain unread. Lichen covers the script. Sections are buried, broken, or eroded. But technology offers new hope. 3D imaging, digital tracing, and linguistic databases have accelerated epigraphic research. Each new translation uncovers another layer of Angkor's soul, a hidden dedication, a forgotten town, a king's lost decree. The temple is still speaking, we just need to learn how to listen. In a way, the inscriptions of Angkor are a conversation across time. They were not written to impress us. They were written because someone somewhere believed the act of writing mattered, that it could shape destiny, that it could carry devotion, that it could outlast death. And in this, they were right. Because as long as the stones stand, the voices carved into them will continue to rise not just toward heaven, but toward all who choose to hear. There is a gate in the jungle, massive stone-carved, crowned with 4 serene faces, staring in every direction. You pass beneath it, and suddenly you are no longer in the world of ordinary cities. You have entered Angkor Thom, the great city, the final and grandest capital of the Khmer Empire. Its walls stretch more than 3 kilometers on each side, forming a square that encloses an area larger than most medieval European towns. But Angkor Thom was not built for ordinary life. It was built as a cosmic city, a political heart, and a spiritual stage where gods and kings coexisted. At the center of this walled world stands the Bayon Temple, its towers crowned with enigmatic faces, 216 in total, each smiling down with a gaze that seems at once knowing and benevolent. These faces are not just decorations. They are the signature of Jayavarman Senant, the king who raised Angkor Thom in the late 12th century. His rule was transformative. A devout Mahayana Buddhist and warrior king, he built hospitals, rest houses, roads, and temples across the empire. But it was Angkor Thom, his masterpiece, that redefined how a city could function as a symbol of power, piety, and protection. Angkor Thom's walls were more than fortifications. They represented the edges of the known world's symbolic mountains, separating the sacred center from the chaos beyond. Each of the 5 monumental gates was aligned with a cardinal direction, allowing controlled access to the city. They were not just passageways, but ritual transitions. As one crossed the bridges lined with gods and demons, the famous Deva Asura balustrades, one was enacting the myth of the churning of the ocean of milk. Even entering the city was an act of cosmic renewal, a movement through legend and into order. Within the walls, Angkor Thom was a marvel of civic and spiritual planning. The streets followed a careful grid. Canals ran in straight lines to distribute water, both practical and symbolic. Residences of priests, nobles, soldiers, and craftsmen clustered in defined zones. Markets thrived near the gates. Monks walked barefoot between shrines. Elephants carried royal envoys through the main avenues. And all of it moved around the magnetic core of the Bayon, its smiling stone faces visible from nearly every corner of the city. Angkor Thom was not simply where people lived. It was where the empire breathed. The Bayon itself was unlike any temple built before or after. It lacked the grand outer galleries of Angkor Wat. Its layout seemed chaotic layers of passageways twisting through darkness and light. But this too was intentional. The Bayon represented the Mahayana Buddhist view of the world, full of illusion, transformation, and interconnection. One could not walk its halls in a straight line, just as one cannot walk through life without being turned by circumstance. The walls depicted both divine and earthly scenes, battlefields, market vendors, festivals, and rituals. It was a temple that contained all of life. Jayavarman Seven's influence extended beyond architecture. He envisioned a city that reflected Buddhist compassion as much as imperial control. Inscriptions found in Angkor Thom speak of charitable hospitals, roads with free lodging for travelers, and sanctuaries for the sick. Over 100 Arogaya Sala healing centers were built across the empire. Water basins were filled not only for rituals, but for public bathing and drinking. This fusion of faith and welfare was revolutionary. The sacred city was not just a palace for the king, it was a refuge for the people. And yet Angkor Thom was still a royal capital. The Phimianikas, or Celestial Palace, stood within the old royal enclosure near the Elephant Terrace. Here, behind high walls and guarded gates, courtly life unfolded: royal audiences, judgments, ceremonies, and daily rituals of kingship. Myths tell of a golden tower where the king met a serpent goddess each night to renew his divine right to rule. Whether truth or legend, it reminds us that Angkor Thom was a city ruled by belief as much as by law. The king was not just sovereign, he was the pivot between earth and heaven. Outside the palace, everyday life continued under the shade of trees and temple towers. Farmers brought rice and fish to market. Children played in courtyards lined with lion statues. Artisans carved sandstone, repaired sculptures, and painted wooden doors. The air would have been filled with scent, incense smoke, fermented fish frangipani blossoms, and with sound chanting, monks' hammers on stone gongs at sunrise. Life in Angkor Thom was not quiet, even if the stones are now. It was vibrant, layered, and sacred, a city alive with movement, ritual, and meaning. Religious tolerance also flourished here, at least for a time. Though Jayavarman VII promoted Mahayana Buddhism, many older temples remained dedicated to Hindu gods. Shrines to Shiva, Vishnu, and Brahma continued to receive offerings. Later kings like Jayavarman III reversed the Buddhist focus and reinstalled Hindu imagery. Statues were destroyed, repurposed, or hidden. Temples changed hands, but not always with violence. Angkor Thom became a palimpsest of belief layered with new meanings revised by time, but never erased. Even today, fragments of both traditions stand side by side, sharing space beneath Bayon roots. What makes Angkor Thom so unique is this cohabitation of empire and eternity. Most ancient cities were built to serve the living, trade, protection, agriculture. But Angkor Thom was built to reflect the divine world. Every gate, pond, and wall echoed cosmic geometry. Every street followed a sacred axis. The city was both a reflection and a rehearsal of heavenly order. To live in Angkor Thom was to wake, walk, and sleep within the universe as the Khmer imagined it. Not simply a location, but a cosmology you could touch. But time is not a respecter of cosmic designs. As the empire declined in the 14th and 15th centuries, Angkor Thom's grandeur faded. The canals dried, the shrines emptied. The city that once held thousands slowly surrendered to the trees. Yet even in ruin, it refused to vanish. The walls still stood, the gates still stared, the Bayon still smiled. And in doing so, they kept the memory of a sacred city alive, hidden beneath vines, waiting to be remembered. Today, walking through Angkor Thom is like stepping between pages of a forgotten epic. Every route that splits a staircase is a reminder that nature always reclaims. Every moss-covered inscription is a voice half-remembered, but also every tower that remains is an act of defiance, a whisper that the sacred never fully dies, that even in silence the city still speaks, not with the roar of armies, but with the breath of stone, the hush of memory, and the smile of a king who believed the city he built could mirror the heavens. Beneath the grandeur of towers and the gaze of stone gods, a different kind of rhythm pulsed through Angkor, one not carved in sandstone, but lived in footsteps, sweat, and silence. This was the heartbeat of daily life. While kings meditated in sanctuaries and monks chanted beneath gilded spires, tens of thousands of ordinary people woke with the sun to tend to fields, trade in marketplaces, and bow before ancestral altars. In the shadow of temples, life bloomed, not divine or heroic, but human, earthy, and continuous. The rice fields stretched like sheets of glass across the land. Angkor's farmers understood the rhythm of rain better than most civilizations of their time. They depended not on wild weather, but on engineered certainty. Canals carried water from barrays, vast artificial reservoirs, into dry paddies, while spillways and moats regulated the flow. This hydraulic system allowed for multiple rice harvests a year, an extraordinary feat in medieval agriculture. These fields fed an empire. And more than that, they fed the temple builders, the courtly households, the monks, and the army. Rice was not just food, it was currency, offering and power. In the early morning, families would gather at the edge of the fields. Fathers inspected the dikes. Mothers carried tools in baskets. Children scattered frogs from the irrigation channels. Work was collective. Hands pulled weeds, seeded plots, and beat the husks free after harvest. But it wasn't just labor, it was ritual. Offerings of incense and flowers were left at field altars. Before each planting, monks might bless the season. There was no clear line between farming and faith. Both were part of the same cycle of giving to the earth and hoping it gave back. Closer to the city gates, marketplaces began to stir. These were not grand bazaars of marble and gold, but open spaces shaded by woven mats and palm leaves. Traders arrived by foot, by ox cart, or by boat. They laid out their goods in wide circles: rice-dried fish, betel nut salt, honey cloth, and clay pots. Money, when it changed hands, came in the form of bartered goods or small metal tokens. But more often, transactions were based on trust and necessity. In a city built on cosmic harmony, commerce, too, followed its own kind of balance. Women played a central role in the market. They controlled much of the petty trade, managed household purchases, and passed news between neighborhoods. A mother might sell fermented fish paste while her daughter haggled for spices. Old women sold herbs used in traditional medicine. Younger vendors sang short jingles to attract attention. And somewhere in the background, a musician might play a soft tune on a flute carved from bamboo. There was chatter, laughter, the clatter of clay bowls, and the occasional dispute. These sounds were as much a part of Angkor as temple bells or royal horns. Beyond the markets were the workshops, zones where artisans shaped the material culture of Angkor. Bronze casters poured molten metal into wax molds. Stone carvers chiseled delicate curls into apsara crowns. Weavers sat at low looms threading colors through cotton or silk. These were not random acts of craft. They followed inherited formulas, sacred proportions, and spiritual meanings. Even a simple water jar might bear the face of a naga or a lotus motif. The ordinary was never entirely separate from the sacred. In Angkor, to make was to honor. Daily rituals wove through every level of life. At dawn, monks left the temples barefoot, holding alms bowls, walking silently through the city. People came to meet them, offering rice fruit and sometimes coins. Children bowed deeply. The act wasn't simply donation, it was a shared moment of humility. In return, the monks offered blessings, brief chants, whispered hopes, folded palms. These morning exchanges reminded everyone, from laborer to noble, that life was transient and merit could be earned with every generous act. Household shrines dotted every neighborhood. These were small, roofed altars standing on stilts or tucked beneath trees. Inside were statues, relics, or painted scrolls. Families lit incense, knelt, and offered flowers, food, and water. Ancestor worship was as vital as temple pilgrimage. The living spoke to the dead as if they had never left. In doing so, they maintained a link between past and present, between memory and responsibility. Even the smallest child learned to bow before the family altar. In Angkor, spirituality began at home. Larger festivals transformed daily life into spectacle. The New Year water festivals and royal anniversaries brought days of music, boat races, masked dances, and shared meals. Monks led processions through the city, carrying banners and chanting verses. At night, the temples glowed with oil lamps, casting shadows that danced on ancient stone. People dressed in their finest robes, women with jasmine in their hair, men with embroidered belts. Children laughed under glowing lanterns. For a few nights, the city became a living prayer, a celebration of life's impermanence, of joy amidst decay. Rituals also marked every stage of life. Births were blessed by monks. Coming-of-age ceremonies were held for boys entering monkhood or military service. Marriages were family-centered but infused with sacred symbols. And death was treated with reverence. Bodies were cremated, ashes scattered or buried near temples. Offerings continued for weeks, even years. The soul was never assumed to be finished. It lingered, it transitioned, and the living were its guides. In a world ruled by karma and rebirth, rituals were maps for the soul's journey. Even the landscape bore the marks of belief. Trees wrapped in colored cloth signified guardian spirits. Stones arranged in circles hinted at ancient fertility rites. Ponds reflected both moonlight and the idea of reflection itself. The land was alive, not metaphorically, but truly in the eyes of those who lived in Angkor. Everything had presence. Everything could be honored or offended. To walk through a rice field or across a stone threshold was not casual. It was entry into a shared spiritual contract. Yet this deeply woven culture was not without change. As dynasties rose and fell, as Hinduism gave way to Mahayana Buddhism and then to Theravada practices, the rituals evolved. Some gods faded, new ones appeared. Old ceremonies were revised or replaced, but the rhythm of life remained. People still rose with the sun, still bowed at thresholds, still told stories over clay bowls of rice. The sacred never fully left. It simply took new forms. Today, walking through Angkor, it's easy to see the temples and forget the people. But if you listen closely, you can still sense them. In the way the stones are worn smooth where feet once passed. In the faint outlines of foundation mounds beyond temple walls. In the narrow paths through the forest that once led to someone's garden. The city was never just about kings and gods. It was about the countless lives lived quietly but meaningfully in their shadow. And perhaps that is what gave Angkor its true power. Not only its towers or inscriptions or scale, but the way its sacred and ordinary worlds were never far apart. In the Khmer Empire, every breath was a ritual, every step a small devotion. And in that quiet blending of survival and reverence, the greatness of Angkor was never just built. It was lived. Empires are often remembered by their kings, but they are built by their people. In the case of Angkor, its greatness was not only a reflection of divine kingship or heavenly design, it was also the result of tireless hands, mindful hearts, and an intricate network of roles carried out by thousands who will never have statues or inscriptions in their honor. They were the lifeblood of the empire: monks and farmers, artisans and healers, laborers and scribes. Their names may not have echoed in Sanskrit poetry, but their presence is still etched into every worn stone and sunken road. At the spiritual heart of Angkor stood the monks. Dressed in saffron robes, they walked barefoot through the streets at dawn, alms bowls in hand. They chanted sutras in temple courtyards, maintained sacred fires, and taught the Dharma to all who came seeking meaning. For many Khmer families, sending a son to the monastery was both an honor and a spiritual investment. Monks were more than religious figures. They were scholars, counselors, and keepers of memory. In an empire where kings invoked gods, monks ensured those gods remained present in the minds of the people. Monasteries were everywhere in temple compounds near reservoirs beside village squares. Some were grand and stone-built, others simple, made of wood and thatch. Within their walls, monks transcribed scriptures onto palm leaves, copied sacred chants, and studied both religion and medicine. Healing was not seen as separate from faith. Monks prepared herbal remedies and treated the sick with prayers and salves. In many ways, they were the first doctors of Angkor. Their influence extended beyond the temple gate into homes, fields, and the very cycles of birth, death, and rebirth that shaped Khmer life. Beside the spiritual class were the builders, the anonymous army who moved, shaped, and assembled the vast skeleton of Angkor. These were not slaves. Many were paid laborers, corvée workers fulfilling royal duty, or artisans born into guilds passed down through generations. They worked in teams: stone haulers, scaffolders, mortar mixers, carvers. Each team had a foreman, and each project followed a plan known to very few. Orders filtered down from temple architects and royal ministers. But it was the hands of these workers that set the stones, chiseled the reliefs, and raised the towers that still defy gravity today. Their work began long before the first stone reached the site. Quarrymen climbed the Kulin Mountains, carving sandstone from cliffs, carving out precise blocks using iron chisels and wedges. Each block, sometimes weighing over a ton, was dragged through the jungle or floated down rivers by barge. Along the route, teams cleared paths, reinforced embankments, and repaired transport rafts. These journeys could take weeks, even months. It was grueling labor under monsoon skies and tropical heat, and yet the stones arrived cut, numbered, and ready to become part of something greater than any single hand. Once on site, the work unfolded like a choreography. Scaffolding was erected, bamboo lattices tied with rope, flexible yet strong. Ramps of earth were built to raise stones to the upper tiers. Each block was placed with extraordinary precision, without mortar, relying entirely on balanced gravity and the accuracy of the cut. Carvers followed behind, etching images of gods, kings, dancers, and battles into the finished surfaces. These were not random pictures. They followed strict iconography, each posture, gesture, and ornament holding specific symbolic meaning. A misplaced hand could distort a myth. The responsibility was immense. In the workshops scattered across Angkor, other artisans toiled with the same devotion. Bronze casters sculpted images of Vishnu or the Buddha. Blacksmiths forged ceremonial weapons. Ceramicists made roof tiles, jars, and water vessels. Cloth weavers dyed fabrics in deep indigo ochre and red spinning silk from local worms. Every item had both use and symbolism. Even a spoon could be decorated with lotus motifs. The boundaries between craft and worship were blurred. To make something well was not just a matter of skill, it was a form of devotion. Among the lesser-seen classes were the scribes and stewards, men who could read, write, and manage the logistics of empire. They recorded land grants, oversaw temple inventories, and ensured offerings were made on time. They maintained temple archives, inscribed legal rulings, and acted as intermediaries between nobles and the common folk. In a world where writing was sacred, these scribes were the quiet mediators of power. The precision of their hands, often seen only in thin lines carved into stone or palm leaf manuscripts, held the memory of an empire together. Women also played dynamic roles in Angkorian society, though they are often hidden in official records. In reality, they were present everywhere, in marketplaces, in fields and homes, and sometimes even in the court. They managed household economies, participated in religious rituals, and preserved oral traditions through stories, songs, and prayers. Apsaras, celestial dancers, featured prominently in temple carvings, suggesting the cultural reverence for grace, rhythm, and femininity. But beyond symbol, real women ran textile operations, sold goods, and taught their children the cycles of offering and respect. Their labor, seen and unseen, sustained the spiritual and social fabric of the city. Families lived in wooden houses raised on stilts, simple structures with woven walls and thatched roofs. Life centered around shared spaces, the kitchen fire, the courtyard, the shrine in the corner. Days began before dawn with food preparation and prayers. Children helped with small tasks, feeding chickens, fetching water. Elders told stories at night, often by oil lamp, sharing tales of gods and past kings. The rhythms were gentle but constant, and through them a sense of order was maintained between nature and human, between individual and community. Festivals brought people together across all classes. Temple grounds filled with laughter, music, and incense smoke. Processions moved through the streets with drums, parasols, and dancers. For a moment, distinctions blurred. The builder and the noble, the monk and the merchant stood side by side in reverence and joy. These were not just celebrations, they were reminders that the greatness of Angkor was not built only by decree or war, but by the shared spirit of its people. Even in death, the people of Angkor carried their values with them. Funeral rites varied by class, but all shared the same belief that death was not an end, but a return, a passing through one door into another life. Ashes were buried near temples or scattered into sacred rivers. Offerings continued for years, rice, incense, and chants sent to guide the spirit. In many ways, the city of Angkor was a living continuum of generations, walking the same roads, praying at the same altars, contributing stone by stone to something greater than themselves. Today, it is easy to marvel at the temples and forget the hands that built them. The faces of kings endure in sculpture, but the faces of workers are lost in dust. And yet their presence remains etched into thresholds, echoed in the grooves of worn stairways, held in the smile of an apsara carved 1,000 years ago. These people did not write history books, but they made history live. And in every stone that still stands, they are speaking. Angkor was more than a city of gods and kings. It was a human city full of laughter, labor, devotion, and daily acts of quiet resilience. In honoring the people of Angkor, we complete the story. Because without them, there would be no towers, no temples, and no legacy, just forest and silence.
Not just irrigation, but a blueprint of the cosmos carved in water.
If temples were the soul of Angkor, then water was its breath. Flowing silently through canals, resting in massive reservoirs, or trickling through moats and ponds, water touched every corner of Khmer life. It was not simply a source of sustenance, it was sacred. In Angkor, water was not just managed, it was revered, engineered, and elevated to the status of myth. And in its quiet motion, it held together an empire. The scale of Angkor's hydraulic system is still difficult to grasp. Spanning hundreds of square kilometers, it included vast barrages, man-made reservoirs linked by an intricate network of canals, spillways, and embankments. These were not primitive ditches. They were feats of precision crafted to balance seasonal monsoon floods with the constant needs of agriculture, urban life, and temple ritual. The West Baray alone is over 8 kilometers long, and 2 kilometers wide, capable of storing tens of millions of cubic meters of water. It is still full today, a silent monument to engineering that defied time. The system worked with both elegance and resilience. During the rainy season, water from the surrounding hills was channeled through primary canals and directed into reservoirs. During the dry months, those same reservoirs released water slowly into rice fields and city moats. This allowed for multiple harvests per year, an agricultural marvel in a tropical climate. But more than that, it sustained the life of Angkor, feeding its people, cooling its stones, filling its ritual pools. In Khmer cosmology, water symbolized the cosmic ocean, the eternal source of all creation. To harness water was not just to survive, it was to align with the divine. Berets were not isolated containers. They were living parts of a broader aquatic grid. The east and west berets were aligned to the cardinal directions, reflecting celestial geometry. Canals linked them to the temples, which were often built on artificial islands within these sacred lakes. At Neak Peen, for example, a central tower rises from a lotus-shaped pool surrounded by 4 auxiliary basins, aligned to the compass points. Each pool once held water believed to possess healing properties, and pilgrims bathed there to restore bodily and spiritual balance. This was more than clever plumbing. It was metaphysical design. The hydraulic system also served as a mirror. Moats surrounding temples reflected their towering spires, doubling their presence and symbolizing the balance between heaven and earth. Water was everywhere, beneath bridges, along avenues, behind houses, beside shrines. It provided fish, cooled the air, and offered a surface on which incense and flower offerings floated. For the people of Angkor, water connected daily life to the sacred. Even a simple act like drawing water from a well could carry ritual significance. The boundaries between utility and worship dissolved beneath the surface. Engineers and hydrologists of the Khmer Empire worked with remarkable foresight. They understood gradients, flow rates, and sedimentation. Spillways were designed to control overflow during floods. Sluice gates regulated pressure. Some canals were even dual-purpose, carrying goods during trade seasons and water during the harvest cycle. Dams were built with stone facings and compacted earth cores. Embankments doubled as roads. The entire landscape was reshaped not to fight nature, but to dance with it. This was engineering in harmony with ecology long before such ideas had names. But these waterworks also served political and symbolic ends. Building a beret was a royal act of legitimacy. Kings who controlled water controlled abundance. By providing rice prosperity and ritual cleanliness, they affirmed their role as cosmic stewards. Temples that stood on artificial islands within berets like the majestic West Mebon became symbols of sacred kingship surrounded by the ocean of creation. The king was at the center like Vishnu on the cosmic sea, and in every direction life radiated outward from water. Villages and farmlands depended on proximity to these hydraulic veins. Life was organized around irrigation schedules. Farmers adjusted their planting and harvesting not by calendar alone, but by the flow and depth of canals. Priests consulted the water level for omens. Even military movements were planned around water when canals could be navigated, when fields became impassable. Water dictated more than survival. It dictated time, faith, politics, and movement. But this intricate system was not immune to change. As Angkor expanded, in centuries past, maintaining the network became increasingly complex. Canals silted up. Berets overflowed or dried too quickly. New temples and cities disrupted older alignments. Deforestation in the surrounding hills altered runoff patterns. Climate change, perhaps in the form of prolonged droughts followed by violent floods, strained the delicate equilibrium. Eventually, the once fluid system began to choke. When the waters faltered, so too did the city. Harvests declined, wells ran dry, temples cracked beneath heat, disease spread in stagnant pools. The balance that had once been so carefully maintained began to unravel, and with it the rhythm of a civilization slowly lost its beat. Some historians argue that this hydraulic failure, more than war or conquest, was the true cause of Angkor's fall. When the water no longer obeyed the city no longer belonged to the gods. And yet the water remains. The West Barai still gleams under the Cambodian sun. Old canals now serve new farmers. The moats reflect clouds and sky just as they once reflected prayers. Birds nest in the reeds. Children swim where kings once bathed. The system is broken but not dead. It has become part of the land's memory, a presence beneath the soil and surface that still whispers of a time when water made empires. To understand Angkor, one must not only look up to its towers, but down to its flows. Beneath every temple lies a network of thought and channel belief and brickwork. The water may seem passive, but it was the empire's most active force. It moved stone-fed cities and carried prayers. And in the stillness of the old reservoirs, the past still ripples. To the Khmer, water was never just water. It was the breath of gods, the ink of creation, the silence between stars. It flowed through the veins of their empire like a sacred thread, binding stone to sky king to cosmos. In a world shaped by Hindu and Buddhist cosmology, water was more than an element, it was a bridge between the visible and the unseen. To control water was not simply to irrigate or cleanse it, was to sustain the universe in miniature. In both Hindu and Buddhist belief systems, the cosmos begins with a vast, boundless ocean, formless, infinite, and waiting to be stirred. From this churning comes life order and divine power. The Khmer absorbed these myths and translated them into the very geography of their capital. The massive berets represented that primordial ocean, and the temples built on islands within them symbolized Mount Meru, the sacred axis of the world. It was a landscape crafted not just for the eye, but for the soul, designed to mirror the structure of the universe as the Khmer imagined it. When pilgrims approached Angkor Wat, they crossed a moat over 190 meters wide, a cosmic ocean separating the mortal world from the sacred center. As they walked the long causeway, flanked by Naga balustrades and lotus-shaped towers, they moved through myth itself. Every step was a passage from disorder to order, from time to timelessness. The journey through water was not just a physical crossing. It was a metaphysical act, one that reenacted the creation of the world and reaffirmed the temple's place at its center. The precision of Angkor's hydraulic system was not purely utilitarian. It reflected the Khmer understanding of balance. Canals that fed the fields were laid out according to cosmological grids. Spillways were placed to reflect directional flow. Water was made to move in harmony with celestial rhythms. Even the shape of reservoirs mattered. The East Beret, for example, stretched from east to west, a symbolic path of the sun. Its placement was not just geographical. It was spiritual architecture designed to align water with the breath of heaven. This sacred geography found one of its most eloquent expressions in the Temple of Neak Peen. At its center stood a round island surrounded by 4 pools aligned to the cardinal points. Each pool represented one of the 4 elements: earth, water, fire, and wind. A small temple rose in the center, connected to each basin by narrow channels. Pilgrims would bathe in each direction, seeking physical and spiritual healing. This was more than ritual cleansing. It was a rebalancing of the body with the cosmos, a reaffirmation of order through sacred water. Inscriptions at Neak Peen and other temples often speak of water as a force of merit. Kings who built berets were said to generate not only crops, but spiritual merit for themselves and their people. To direct water well was to demonstrate harmony with Dharma, the righteous order of the universe. A king who failed to manage water was seen as having lost that alignment. In this way, water governance was inseparable from moral governance. The channels of state mirrored the channels of heaven. The central tower of Angkor Wat, rising above its reflecting moat, was the symbolic summit of Mount Meru. But the water surrounding it gave the structure life, like a jewel suspended above a mirror. Reflections mattered. They doubled the temple, casting its image into the rippling stillness. This was not vanity, it was philosophy. Just as the world is but a reflection of the divine, so too was the temple's image, a reminder that what is seen is always only part of what is true. The presence of water extended into everyday temple life. Ceremonial baths were conducted before major rituals. Sacred water was sprinkled on statues, altars, and worshippers. Monks used water in healing, exorcism, and meditation. Rain itself was seen as a blessing, a celestial confirmation that cosmic balance was intact. When it failed to come, the people fasted, prayed, and performed elaborate rituals to invite its return. Water was not just drawn, it was invoked, honored, and feared. Even the act of irrigation had spiritual meaning. Drawing water from the beret into the rice fields was likened to the gods bestowing life onto the earth. Farmers didn't simply flood their paddies. They engaged in acts of renewal, returning vitality to the land, continuing the cycle of karma through labor. Seasonal changes were observed not only with planting, but with ceremony. The first rains marked the beginning of the agricultural year, and temples held processions to mark this transition. Water was calendar offering and prophecy. The alignment of temples with waterways also created spiritual circuits, routes of pilgrimage, trade, and political movement that followed the same flows. Processions would move by boat through sacred canals. Pilgrims would arrive to bathe in holy pools before entering a shrine. Even the royal processions were choreographed to follow water, arriving by barge, flanked by chanting priests and burning incense. These were not random traditions. They were enactments of divine choreography. Movement on water was movement through cosmic time, but the reverence for water was not passive. The Khmer understood its power to destroy as well as to give life. Dams had to be watched, canals cleared sediment, dredged banks rebuilt. The balance was delicate. Too much water and the city flooded. Too little and the crops withered. In this constant dance, the Khmer saw a lesson that the world could not be controlled, only harmonized. And it was this harmony they pursued, not domination, but deep attunement with the forces that flowed through both land and spirit. Temples like Preah Khan and Ta Prohm, built by Jayavarman VII, were intentionally constructed near ancient water sources. In some cases, entire reservoirs were restored or expanded to serve the sacred geography. These temples became centers of pilgrimage precisely because of their location, where water, stone, and jungle met in quiet union. Visitors did not just come to pray. They came to feel the alignment, to experience a serenity that came not from silence, but from balance. In the reflection of still waters, the mind too could become still. Today, many of the canals are dry, their beds filled with silt and grass. The berets are no longer pristine, and some moats have broken banks, but the symbolic power remains. When you walk through Angkor after the rain and the puddles mirror the temple spires, you are seeing what the Khmer saw: a world above and a world below, each echoing the other. A reflection not only of stone, but of belief. In a civilization where every stone was placed with intention, water was the element that gave it breath. It moved through Angkor like a sacred verse, invisible, essential, eternal. In its presence, the city found its balance. In its flow, the people found meaning. And in its silence, we find something still speaking, an ancient reminder that the universe too is always in motion, always returning to the source. For centuries, water had obeyed the will of kings. It moved as they directed, filling the berets, nourishing the rice fields, reflecting the temples of gods. It was the great servant of Angkor, carrying both grain and faith across its canals. But eventually something shifted. The rivers turned erratic. The skies grew unpredictable. And the waters, once symbols of balance and control, became messengers of change. At first, the changes were subtle. Canals took longer to fill. Reservoirs needed more maintenance. Farmers noted the fields were slower to flood. But the empire was strong. Kings still built temples, still rose. Rituals continued. It was easy to believe that the problem lay not in nature, but in human effort. More workers were summoned. More earth was moved. Yet the flow of water remained uneasy, as if the land itself were hesitating. Over time, the symptoms multiplied. Periods of drought grew longer. Then when the rains finally came, they came violently, flooding the channels, eroding the embankments, overwhelming the system. The delicate balance of the hydraulic network was disrupted. Without steady water, rice production faltered. Without rice, the foundations of Angkor's economy, religion, and power began to crack. The empire, so deeply reliant on its control of water, now faced the consequences of losing it. Scholars today speak of climate change not in modern terms, but in historical cycles. Evidence from sediment cores and tree rings suggests that Angkor experienced several severe droughts during the 14th and 15th centuries, punctuated by periods of intense monsoon flooding. These sudden shifts placed unbearable stress on the infrastructure. The canals silted. The berets broke their banks. The earthworks that had once carried life now carried destruction. The very system that had elevated Angkor became its vulnerability. But this collapse was not only environmental, it was symbolic. In Khmer cosmology, water represented cosmic harmony. Its flow affirmed the king's righteousness, the universe's balance. When the water faltered, it signaled more than hunger. It signaled disconnection from heaven, from Dharma, from the sacred geometry that held the world together. The people did not just see dry fields, they saw broken promises, temples that no longer reflected the sky, and kings whose divine mandate was slipping through their fingers like sand. Attempts were made to repair what had failed. Jayavarman VIII and his successors restored parts of the system, dredged canals, rebuilt levees. Some temples were retrofitted with new moats and water channels, but the effort was enormous and the cohesion of the empire was already thinning. Regional governors grew more autonomous. Border provinces became restless. As the water system crumbled, so did the unity it had once supported. Angkor, no longer nourished by its sacred veins, began to shrink inward. Meanwhile, neighboring powers were rising. The Siamese kingdom of Ayutthaya launched incursions into Khmer territory. In 1431, they sacked the city of Angkor Thom, an event often cited as the symbolic end of Angkor's classical period. But in truth, the decline had begun earlier, invisibly, with the silent retreat of water. No fire or sword could destroy Angkor as completely as the erosion of its lifeblood. When the water stopped flowing, the soul of the city faded with it. Yet the people did not vanish overnight. Life slowly migrated downstream toward more sustainable environments along the Mekong and Tonle Sap. Theravada Buddhism, more modest in architecture and less reliant on massive temple cities, began to take root. The grandeur of Angkor gave way to simpler forms of devotion. The vast berets fell quiet. The temples stood alone, reflections, faded stones, cracked under sun and vine. But the memory remained. Nature reclaimed the land with patience. Trees split stairways, roots coiled through sanctuaries. Rain carved patterns where prayers had once been chanted. The canals became forest paths. The reservoirs turned to marshes. And still the stones stood bearing witness, not to a cataclysm, but to a slow unweaving. The silence of water was not a roar. It was a whisper repeated over generations until the city was only myth again. Centuries later, explorers stumbled upon the ruins swallowed by jungle and time. They marveled at the temples, but many did not understand the emptiness around them. They looked for causes in conquest, in abandonment, in invasion. Few realized that the true unraveling had begun with water, with an imbalance too subtle for chronicles, too slow for legend. The collapse of Angkor was not a fall, it was a fading. Today, the ancient berets remain mirrors of the past, holding rain and memory. Fishermen cast nets where engineers once surveyed flow rates. Children swim where kings once performed ablutions. The West Beret still glistens at sunrise, a great lake that once defined an empire. Its silence is profound. But if you listen, you might still hear it, the story of a civilization that rose by honoring water and fell when it could no longer hold the rhythm of the rain. Angkor was never just a city of stone. It was a city of currents, physical, spiritual, political. Its greatness flowed through channels dug by hand, guided by stars, blessed by monks. When that current was broken, the stone remained, but the life receded. In the end, it was not war that brought down the Khmer Empire. It was the slow forgetting of how to flow in harmony with the world that sustained it. And yet that lesson remains. Carved into earthworks, echoed in ruins, reflected in moats. That water, gentle, invisible, essential, may be the greatest teacher of all. For it teaches not through power, but through presence. And when it stops moving, we must ask not only what failed, but what we forgot to honor.
Not rulers of men, but architects of destiny.
Every empire has a beginning, but not every beginning becomes legend. For the Khmer, it began in the forests of Kulen Mountain, where a man named Jayavarman II declared something the land had never heard before, that there would be one king, one realm, and that he would be its god. This was not just the founding of a dynasty, it was the birth of an idea, a radical redefinition of kingship that merged divine authority with earthly command. In one bold proclamation, he did not simply unite lands, he united heaven and earth under his rule. Before Jayavarman II, the lands that would become the Khmer Empire were fractured small kingdoms and chiefdoms, bound by fragile alliances and frequent rivalry. Indianized in culture but locally ruled, these principalities looked outward for trade and inward for identity. It was Jayavarman who saw in this patchwork the outline of something greater. He moved from region to region, not just conquering, but consolidating. By the end of his journey, he had claimed the Mekong lowlands, Kalen's highlands, and the symbolic right to speak for all Khmer people. What set Jayavarman II apart was not merely his conquests, it was his vision. In the year 802 CE, on the sacred heights of Mahendraparvata, the mountain of the gods, he held a royal ceremony that changed history. In this rite, known as the Devaraja ceremony, Jayavarman declared himself a Chakravartin, a universal monarch and the earthly manifestation of a divine protector. Whether Shiva or another deity, the message was clear: the king was no longer merely chosen by the gods. He was the divine presence incarnate, the pivot between the mortal world and the eternal. This act was revolutionary. It didn't just elevate Jayavarman above his rivals, it restructured the Khmer worldview. Now to serve the king was to serve the cosmos. Loyalty became sacred. Rebellion became blasphemy. The capital was no longer just an administrative center, it was the navel of the world. The temple was not only a house for gods, it was a throne for the king's soul. Jayavarman had laid the foundation not just for a political empire, but for a civilizational myth that would endure for 6 centuries. His capital, likely located on the Kalen Plateau, was carved out of dense forest, overlooking the surrounding plains like a watchful deity. Archaeological remains, gridded roads, early temple foundations, waterworks suggest an ambitious experimental city. Though little remains today, Mahendraparvata was likely the first expression of sacred urbanism in the Khmer world. It was where Jayavarman began the fusion of stone spirit and state, the fusion that would later reach its apotheosis at Angkor. Jayavarman II was also a master of symbolism. He understood that power alone could be challenged, but sacred power encoded in ritual and carved into stone would endure. He commissioned temples not merely to honor deities, but to inscribe his own divine mandate into the landscape. These early shrines were modest compared to later Angkorian wonders, but they bore the seed of something immense. They spoke not just of devotion, but of permanence. The god-king had arrived, and he intended to remain. Under Jayavarman's reign, the idea of kingship underwent a transformation. He centralized authority, established court protocols, and began the slow erosion of regional autonomy. Land was claimed in the king's name, and religious authority was brought under royal patronage. Even the language of inscriptions changed, becoming more formulaic, more aligned with divine praise. The royal cult of Devaraja, the god-king, grew in strength, shaping not only politics but the architecture, urban planning, and theology of every ruler who came after him. Yet for all his reforms and power, Jayavarman II remains an enigma. No life-size statues survive. His temples are fragmented. His face, unlike later kings, is not immortalized in stone. Much of what we know comes from later inscriptions, echoes of a reign whose physical traces have faded. And yet his presence is everywhere in Khmer history, not as a shadow but as a foundation. Every tower, every beret, every cosmic alignment owes something to his vision. Perhaps his greatest legacy is the myth he created. Jayavarman II turned the Khmer king into something no other Southeast Asian monarch had dared to be: a sacred being whose rule was written into the sky in stone. This idea allowed later kings to command enormous resources to mobilize entire populations in the construction of temples, cities, and reservoirs. It justified the grandeur of Angkor. It sanctified the labor of builders. It gave spiritual meaning to empire itself. Even after his death, likely around 835 CE, Jayavarman's influence lingered. His successors inherited not just his lands, but his ideology. And with each new temple, the god-king grew more powerful. By the time Angkor Wat rose 5 centuries later, the Devaraja cult had become inseparable from Khmer identity. Jayavarman II had become more than a founder. He had become a cornerstone in the architecture of belief. Today, as we stand before the silent ruins of Angkor, we must remember that none of it would have been possible without that first voice on the mountain, without that first act of daring, of merging man and God kingdom and cosmos. Jayavarman II may not be carved into lintels or worshipped in shrines, but he is present in every corridor, every tower that points to the stars. His reign was the spark, and from it an empire of stone was born. Every civilization has its golden age, and every golden age has its monument. For the Khmer Empire, that monument is Angkor Wat, and behind its towering spires and endless galleries stands the name of one king, Suryavarman II. He was not the first to build temples, nor the last to seek divine favor, but he was the one who dared to translate cosmic order into stone on a scale the world had never seen. Through Angkor Wat, he carved his legacy into eternity. Suryavarman II ascended the throne in the early 12th century after a period of political unrest. He was a military strategist, a bold centralizer, and a devout follower of Vishnu, an unusual choice in a court traditionally aligned with Shiva. His reign was marked by ambition, diplomacy, and conquest. He extended Khmer influence westward into what is now Thailand and southward toward the coast. But it was not only his sword that defined him. It was his vision to create a temple that would outlive empires and echo the divine order of the universe. Angkor Wat was that vision made manifest. Unlike previous temples, it faced west, the direction associated with Vishnu and possibly the setting sun and death. But this was no funerary monument alone. It was a cosmic palace, a spiritual calendar, and a symbol of royal legitimacy. Its 5 towers represented the peaks of Mount Meru. Its moats represented the oceans of the cosmos. Its walls formed sacred boundaries. To enter Angkor Wat was not just to enter a sanctuary, it was to step into the structure of creation itself. The temple's scale defies comprehension. Spanning over 400 acres with more than 2,000 intricately carved apsaras and hundreds of meters of bas-reliefs, Angkor Wat was and remains the largest religious monument in the world. Every stone was placed with purpose. Every gallery, tower, and causeway followed precise mathematical and cosmological logic. It was not merely built to impress, it was built to align to mark solstices, equinoxes, and divine rhythms hidden in the sky. One of the most remarkable aspects of Angkor Wat is its sense of movement. As pilgrims walk from the west toward the central sanctuary, they ascend, gradually passing through increasingly sacred spaces, rising metaphorically from the mortal world to the divine summit. This was no accident. Suryavarman II's architects designed the temple as a journey, one that reflected the king's own aspiration to transcend mortality and claim a place among the gods. Angkor Wat was both his gift to Vishnu and his gateway to immortality. The temple's bas-reliefs speak volumes about Suryavarman's ideology. One panel famously depicts the king himself seated under a ceremonial parasol, surrounded by soldiers, parasangs, and ministers. He is calm, composed, almost otherworldly. This is not the portrait of a warrior in battle, but of a ruler whose authority radiates from sacred stillness. Other panels show scenes from the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, and the churning of the ocean of milk. These are not just mythic tales, they are mirrors of kingship, order, and cosmic struggle. Suryavarman placed himself within this lineage not just beside the gods, but as a vital part of their unfolding narrative. Unlike later kings who would be remembered for Buddhist devotion or social reform, Suryavarman II was remembered for scale and ambition. He united architecture, astronomy, religion, and royal identity into a single project that redefined the very concept of sacred space. He was both patron and symbol, commander and devotee. The sheer human effort required to construct Angkor Wat, quarrying, transporting, carving, aligning, was staggering. It took decades, but the result was timeless. And yet, as with many rulers, Suryavarman's final years are shrouded in mystery. Some inscriptions suggest he died in battle, possibly during a failed campaign in what is now Vietnam. Others hint at court intrigues and succession struggles. What we do know is that after his death, work on Angkor Wat ceased abruptly. Some unfinished carvings still remain, tools frozen mid-gesture corners, smooth but unadorned. The temple became a monument not only to celestial design, but to a life interrupted. Despite this, Angkor Wat never lost its centrality. It survived changes in faith from Hinduism to Buddhism and changes in dynasty. It became a site of pilgrimage, prayer, and royal memory. Later kings added their marks, but the core remained untouched. Even during the decline of the empire, even when the jungle closed in Angkor, Wat endured. Like the spirit of the king who built it, it refused to fade. Today, the temple stands not just as an architectural wonder, but as a document, a record of what one king believed was possible when human effort aligned with cosmic will. Visitors walk its galleries, stand beneath its towers, and see shadows of something far greater than any one reign. They see the dream of Suryavarman II, a man who sought to embody harmony, to rule through myth, and to leave behind something that even time could not erase. His name may not be widely known outside of Cambodia. His face may not be carved into giant towers like Jayavarman VII, but his presence is everywhere, in the lotus-crowned spires, in the symmetrical stones that still kiss the equinox sun, in the corridors where silence walks beside reflection. Suryavarman II did not build just a temple. He built a mirror of heaven, and in doing so gave his empire something it would carry long after its borders faded. Some kings built empires with swords, others with silence. Jayavarman VII used both. He rose from the ashes of invasion from a kingdom shaken by defeat and forged the Khmer Empire's greatest spiritual and territorial expansion. His reign was not just powerful, it was transformative. Warrior, monk, reformer, and builder Jayavarman VII was all these things and yet more than any single title could define. When he came to power in the late 12th century, the Khmer Empire was reeling. The capital had been sacked by the invading Cham traditional rivals from the east. Temples had burned. Order had fractured. It was in this moment of chaos that Jayavarman emerged not as a prince of pomp, but as a commander of resilience. He reclaimed lost territory, drove back the Cham, and restored Khmer pride. But conquest was only the beginning. Unlike his predecessors, Jayavarman VII was deeply influenced by Mahayana Buddhism, a school of thought centered not on personal liberation, but on universal compassion. It changed everything. In his eyes, a ruler's duty was not only to govern, but to heal, to be a bodhisattva king, one who delays his own enlightenment to ease the suffering of others. He built roads, hospitals, rest houses, and temples. His kingdom became not just a dominion of land, but of care. The Bayon temple at the heart of Angkor Wat became his signature. Its towers bear giant, serene faces, smiling, closed-eyed, timeless. Some believe they represent Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva of compassion. Others say they are Jayavarman himself, transcended and omnipresent. Whatever their identity, the message is clear. This was a city watched over not by wrath, but by wisdom. Under his reign, Angkor Wat grew into a sacred capital where spiritual ideals guided stone and state alike. Jayavarman's ambition stretched beyond religious symbolism. He built over 100 Arogayasala, free hospitals scattered across the empire. He ordered the construction of Dhammasala rest houses along major roads to shelter travelers. He reformed administration, strengthened irrigation, and commissioned massive public works. To him, the welfare of the people was the manifestation of Dharma. Infrastructure was not merely practical, it was moral. And yet his reign was not without contradiction. While preaching compassion, he continued military campaigns, expanding Khmer influence deeper into modern-day Laos and Thailand. The construction of his temples and roads required enormous labor. The scale of his building projects, Prayakanta, Prom Bayon, demanded resources that only imperial force could supply. In this, Jayavarman embodied both monk and monarch, compassionate yet commanding, generous yet absolute. He also left his mark on religious art and iconography. Under his rule, depictions of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas multiplied, blending with traditional Hindu motifs. Temples that once honored Shiva or Vishnu were rededicated to the Buddha. Inscriptions spoke of selflessness, devotion, and the path of the awakened one. But after his death, this Buddhist dominance would be reversed. His successors, perhaps threatened by his legacy, reinstated Hindu traditions and defaced many Buddhist statues. The tides of belief shifted, but his vision endured in stone. Jayavarman VII ruled for over 3 decades. When he died, likely around 1218 CE, he left behind an empire that stretched farther than ever before and a city that pulsed with spiritual vitality. But his passing marked the beginning of transition. The monumental momentum he had created began to slow. His successors could not match his balance of vision and authority, and in the decades that followed, the cracks began to show. Still, he remains the most beloved of Khmer monarchs, not because he ruled without flaw, but because he ruled with purpose. He fused conquest with conscience. He wore the crown not only as a symbol of power, but as a responsibility to alleviate suffering. And in doing so, he transformed Angkor from a city of gods and kings into a city of people and prayers. Walk the corridors of Bayon and you still feel him. in the quiet gaze of the stone faces, in the symmetry of temples that seemed to breathe, in the shadows of halls where monks once chanted and nurses tended to the sick. Jayavarman VII built not just an empire, but a moral architecture, one that still stands whispering across centuries, that greatness lies not only in what you build, but in who you build it for. No empire lasts forever. Even those carved in stone, built by divine kings and guided by cosmic symmetry, must one day face the slow erosion of time. For the Khmer Empire, the twilight did not begin with fire, but with a shift in balance, a fading of strength, of unity, of vision. And then in the 15th century came a moment that would mark the symbolic end, the invasion of Angkor by the Siamese kingdom of Ayutthaya. It was not the first threat Khmer rulers had faced, nor the most violent, but it came at a time when Angkor was already tired, and that made all the difference. Long before the armies crossed the border, the signs had already gathered. The hydraulic system that once defined Angkor's prosperity was faltering. Years of drought and sudden floods, evidenced by sediment cores and broken canal banks, had unbalanced the land. Harvest became less reliable. Population centers shifted southward. The power of regional nobles grew as the central court struggled to maintain control. Inscriptions became fewer. Grand temple construction had slowed. It was as though the empire itself had begun to look inward, unsure of the stories it used to tell itself. Meanwhile, in the west, a new power had risen. Ayutthaya, founded in 1350, was expanding aggressively across mainland Southeast Asia. The Siamese were formidable, unified, ambitious, and adaptive. They absorbed elements of Khmer architecture, religion, and governance, but with a hunger to surpass their predecessors. Khmer influence could be seen in the temples of Ayutthaya, in their court rituals, even in the language. But admiration did not prevent invasion. To control Angkor was to claim legitimacy. To defeat the empire of the gods was to become the inheritor of heaven's favor. The exact date of the invasion remains debated, but most scholars agree that in 1431 CE, Ayutthayan forces entered Angkor Thom. The great city, once the beating heart of Southeast Asia, fell quietly without the fanfare of conquest legends. There are no grand records of a last stand, no tales of burning towers or walls stormed in waves. What we know is silence. The inscriptions stop. The temples are no longer maintained. The priests leave. The royal court moves south, perhaps to Longvek or Udong. The city that once ruled an empire becomes a city of ghosts. But the invasion was not just a military event, it was a spiritual rupture. For centuries, Khmer kings had claimed to rule by divine mandate. Their capital was not merely a seat of governance, but a mirror of the heavens. When foreign soldiers marched through the gates of Angkor Thom, they did not just take territory, they walked through the center of a sacred universe. What does it mean when gods are conquered? When the cosmic order is breached not by drought or decline, but by marching feet and foreign banners. The Siamese may not have razed Angkor to the ground, but the symbolic damage was complete. Angkor was no longer the inviolable heart of the world. It was vulnerable, mortal, and in that moment the spell was broken. The Khmer royal line continued, but it was never again able to summon the monumental energy of Jayavarman VII or the cosmic ambition of Suryavarman II. The center had shifted not just politically but psychologically. The age of god-kings had ended. Yet even in twilight, things do not vanish all at once. People remained in Angkor after the invasion, monks, villagers, traders. The temples were never truly abandoned, only quieted. Buddhism, particularly the Theravada tradition, grew stronger, taking root where the old Devaraja cult had weakened. Temples once devoted to Vishnu or Shiva were repurposed. New prayers filled old corridors. The sacredness of the place never disappeared, but its meaning transformed from center of empire to place of memory. The Siamese invasion also signaled a larger shift in the regional order. For centuries, the Khmer had been the cultural and political engine of the region, but now the gravitational center moved westward to Ayutthaya and eventually to Bangkok. Trade patterns changed. New alliances were formed. The Mekong Delta became a contested zone, and the once mighty Angkor faded from the maps of diplomacy, becoming a name remembered more for its ruins than its influence. Still, it would be a mistake to view this twilight only as a tragedy. Decline is not the same as disappearance. The legacy of Angkor lived on in architecture, language, and religious practice. Its sacred geometry inspired temples far beyond its borders. Khmer artisans, displaced by war and patronage shifts, carried their knowledge with them into Laos, Thailand, and beyond. And within Cambodia itself, the idea of Angkor became a cultural touchstone, a memory of greatness that no conquest could erase. In the centuries that followed, travelers and scholars would rediscover Angkor buried in vines and legend. Western explorers would stand in awe before its towers, unable to reconcile its grandeur with their assumptions about Southeast Asia. But for Cambodians, Angkor had never been truly lost. It remained in oral histories and temple rituals in the national imagination. The stones endured, and in their endurance they whispered not only of what was, but of what still could be. Today, the Siamese invasion is remembered not with bitterness, but with reverence. Not for the conquerors, but for the resilience that followed. The twilight of Angkor was not a collapse. It was a transformation. A moment when history passed from hand to hand, not as destruction, but as inheritance. What was lost in empire was preserved in spirit. What fell in stone rose again in culture. The gates of Angkor Thom still stand weathered but intact. The faces of Bayon still smile with mysterious calm. The West Barai still holds water. And in the early mornings, as monks walk the ancient paths in saffron robes, the city still feels alive, less a ruin, more a memory made visible. The gods may have fallen silent, but their echo remains. And in that echo, the Khmer Empire still speaks.
Was it war? Was it water? Or was it time?
Great empires rarely fall with a single blow. Their collapse is not a moment, but a process, a long unraveling that begins silently, hidden in floods and whispers, in rituals left unfinished. For Angkor, the fall did not begin with swords, but with water. The same water that had fed its rice, cooled its temples, and reflected its gods began to betray it. First in subtle shifts, then in sudden violence. And soon the rhythm that had once moved like a sacred current through the empire became erratic, fragmented, lost. Evidence drawn from sediment cores in the Angkor region reveals a pattern: decades of intense drought, followed by periods of devastating monsoon floods. The delicate hydraulic system, once Angkor's pride, was built for predictability. It depended on steady rains, seasonal flows, and careful management. But when the climate changed, the system could not adapt fast enough. Canals cracked and dried, reservoirs overflowed and collapsed, the great barrays filled with silt, and the city once fed by its sacred waters began to thirst. As rice yields declined, so did the confidence of the people. Angkor's population had grown large, perhaps too large for the land to sustain under unstable conditions. Famine took root not as a sudden crisis, but as a quiet thinning fields left empty granaries running low prayers for rain growing more urgent. The social contract between king and cosmos began to strain. For centuries, the king had promised abundance. Now the land refused to listen, and with every failed harvest, the illusion of divine order faded. But it wasn't just nature that unstitched the empire. War had its hand too. The 13th and 14th centuries brought pressure from every direction. The Cham to the east had long been rivals. The Siamese to the west were rising fast. And within the empire itself, provincial governors and nobles began to act with increasing autonomy. The tightly woven hierarchy established by Jayavarman VII and his predecessors began to fray. Loyalty shifted from king to clan. Temples once maintained by royal decree fell into neglect. Stone began to crack not just from time, but from abandonment. Repeated invasions from Ayutthaya further weakened Angkor's ability to recover. Although not always catastrophic in force, these incursions destabilized trade, disrupted agriculture, and demoralized the court. Diplomacy failed. Tribute turned to conflict. What had once been a dominant empire now found itself defending instead of expanding. The psychological weight of retreat replaced the confidence of cosmic authority. The center no longer held. The margins no longer obeyed. Overreach played its part as well. The empire had stretched far too far, perhaps. Maintaining control over distant provinces required enormous administrative and military resources. Roads, rest houses, and irrigation systems all demanded labor and coordination. Jayavarman VII's grand projects, though visionary, had left the state exhausted. The infrastructure was impressive but heavy. And when the rains failed or enemies advanced, the very scale of Angkor's ambition became a liability. It had built for eternity, but eternity demands maintenance. Religion too shifted in a way that reflected deeper fractures. The Devaraja cult, which had once bound king and god as one lost its grip. Theravada Buddhism, less hierarchical and more personal in its practice, spread rapidly across the empire. It emphasized individual merit over divine kingship. Temples once filled with celestial processions now echoed with the soft steps of meditating monks. Statues of Shiva and Vishnu were replaced or recontextualized. In this quiet theological revolution, the role of the king diminished from cosmic axis to secular ruler. And without the spiritual scaffolding that had held Khmer kings above question, the throne stood bare. Art and inscriptions from the later periods reflect a tone of resignation. The grand bas-reliefs of Angkor Wat and Bayon give way to more modest depictions. Inscriptions grow shorter, more formulaic. There are fewer declarations of divine lineage, fewer poetic boasts. The language becomes dry, administrative, almost tired. The stories of gods no longer stretch across walls, they are compressed, faded, or stopped mid-sentence. Even the stone seems to hesitate. The slow collapse of Angkor was not widely recorded. Unlike other civilizations that chronicled their own decline, with epic laments, the Khmer left behind only silence. No grand elegy, no farewell inscription. Just absence temples without incense canals, without water roads, without footsteps. Historians must reconstruct the end through fragments, a broken aqueduct, a neglected shrine, a shift in pollen grains buried in lake beds. Angkor did not fall with a scream. It exhaled, then faded. And yet the people did not disappear. Life continued just elsewhere. The royal court moved southward, eventually settling in Longvek and later Udong. Populations migrated closer to the Mekong and Tonle Sap, where water was more reliable and trade routes more favorable. The grandeur of empire gave way to the intimacy of village life. The scale shrank, but the spirit endured. Angkor was not forgotten. It was carried quietly in stories, rituals, and songs. In a strange twist, the fall of Angkor allowed for the rise of a more egalitarian spirituality. Theravada Buddhism flourished in the absence of state-sponsored monumentality. Simpler temples appeared built of wood and brick, closer to communities and daily life. Monastic networks replaced imperial roads. And a new kind of resilience emerged, one not anchored in stone, but in adaptability. The empire was gone, but its people remained. Today, when we walk through the ruins, we are not simply visiting the past, we are walking through the process of forgetting. Each tree root that splits a staircase, each vine that wraps a lintel, each stone worn smooth by centuries of rain, is part of the same long exhale. Angkor teaches us that collapse is rarely loud. It is slow, invisible, cumulative. It happens when systems no longer serve, when beliefs no longer bind, when ambition outpaces sustainability. But Angkor also teaches us something else, that even in decline, beauty endures. The temples still rise. The reservoirs still catch rain. The carvings still whisper myths beneath moss. The city may have fallen, but its soul remains etched in silence, in shadow and light. Not dead, only transformed. When the last royal footstep left Angkor, the jungle did not roar, it waited. It did not strike with violence or haste, but with patience, quiet, and breath. Over time, it crept in leaf by leaf, root by root, until it was no longer clear where architecture ended and nature began. Banyan trees slipped their fingers into cracks. Moss softened the edges of warriors carved in stone. And in this slow embrace, the jungle began its quiet work, not to destroy Angkor, but to take it back. The forest was not an enemy of the temples. It was their patient steward. Where kings no longer swept the causeways, leaves did. Where monks no longer lit incense, sunlight filtered through a green canopy. Temples that once blazed with rituals, now hummed with insects, rustled with wind, echoed with bird calls. Nature became the new priest, performing its own liturgy in vines and shadows. It was not desecration, it was transformation. Roots became columns. Branches formed vaulted ceilings. In places like Taprom, massive trees grew directly from stone, their limbs stretching through doorways, their trunks splitting walls. Yet the structures did not fall. Instead, they yielded stone, en route weaving into one another in an embrace that seemed almost deliberate. The jungle did not erase the temples. It preserved them through intimacy. What the empire abandoned, the forest cradled. For centuries, these ruins slept. Locals never forgot them. They called Angkor Wat the city of temples. Pilgrims still came. Offerings were still made. But the outside world had turned its gaze elsewhere. Trade routes had shifted, powers had changed, and the great capitals of the world had new names. Angkor faded from maps, but never from memory. And all the while, the jungle deepened its hold, keeping the stones company in their silence. Nature's reclamation was not random, it was ritual in reverse. The same energy that once animated temple building now dissolved it. Lintels cracked where rain had seeped for centuries. Sandstones softened beneath the pressure of root and time. But the carvings remained weathered but visible. Faces still smiled beneath veils of ivy. Dancers still moved frozen mid-step, watched only by birds and lizards. The jungle did not wipe the slate clean. It turned each temple into a meditation on impermanence. Animals returned to what had once been cities. Elephants wandered through outer gates. Monkeys leapt from tower to tower. Snakes coiled in crypts once lit with sacred flame. Insects buzzed where drums once rolled. The jungle's inhabitants became its new court, moving through halls built for kings, resting in sanctuaries built for gods. Life did not end in Angkor, it changed its form. It whispered instead of sang. The irony is profound. The Khmer had once sought to master nature, to control water, to shape land, to align temples with the stars. They had moved mountains of stone, redirected rivers, carved stories into cliffs. But when the empire receded, the forest waited with infinite patience. It needed no war to reclaim the land. Just time, just rain, just light. Still, not all temples disappeared equally. Angkor Wat remained in use, continually maintained by monks and revered by locals. Its massive moat kept much of the encroaching jungle at bay. But elsewhere, temples like Bang Mealia and Tasum slowly vanished beneath the green tide. Stone roads once alive with pilgrims turned into paths for deer and shadows. Gatehouses became nests. Libraries became gardens. And time became the only scribe. What was lost during those centuries was not just political power or territorial control, it was knowledge. The names of certain kings, the meaning of obscure rituals, the purpose of lesser shrines, they faded from memory. Without caretakers, inscriptions wore away. Without scribes, oral histories became fragmented. And yet, strangely, the emptiness made room for new stories. Myths arose. Locals spoke of giants who built the temples overnight, of vanished races, of enchanted cities swallowed by divine will. The jungle became not just a force of nature, but a keeper of secrets. When French explorers rediscovered Angkor in the 19th century, they found a world unlike any other. They arrived expecting ruins and found cathedrals of stone wrapped in the arms of trees. They expected silence and found a hum of life. Their reports filled European salons with wonder but also misconception. To them, Angkor had been lost. But to Cambodians, it had simply been waiting, resting beneath the roots, breathing beneath the vines. What the jungle preserved, it also altered. Restoration efforts in the 20th and 20th centuries faced an impossible question. Should the trees be removed to protect the stone, or should they remain as part of the site's unique identity? The answer in many places was to compromise, to let root and wall coexist, to allow the story of collapse to remain visible. Because Angkor's story is not just about what was built, it is also about what was let go, what was returned to the earth. Today, visitors walk through halls once overgrown, now cleared. They see fragments of grandeur, traces of glory, beauty, and decay. But if they listen carefully, they might hear the jungle still speaking, not in words but in wind, in the hush between footfalls, in the leaves that fall slowly across ancient stone. The forest does not forget. It remembers in the language of patience. The kings of Angkor once ruled with divine mandate. They carved their names into time, but it was the jungle, soft, slow, and indifferent, that claimed their temples in the end. Not as conqueror, but as caretaker. And in that act of gentle reclamation, it ensured that what was forgotten by men would be remembered by trees. At the height of its glory, Angkor pulsed with ritual. Drums echoed before sunrise. Priests carried incense through halls that rang with Sanskrit chants. Dancers moved in precise arcs beneath the watchful eyes of carved apsaras. Ceremonies were not occasional, they were constant, woven into the rhythm of the city itself. Every canal, every lotus pond, every carved deity had meaning, had a role to play in this choreography between heaven and earth. But slowly, as kings fell and temples cracked, the rituals grew quiet. The offerings stopped first, no more flowers placed at the feet of gods. Then the processions ceased, their paths overgrown. Finally, even the chants faded, their last syllables echoing against stone before being swallowed by the wind. In their place came a different kind of sound, the hush of trees, the shuffle of leaves, the soft footsteps of wild animals moving through places once meant for kings. Yet the silence was not empty. It was full of memory, a presence of something that lingers long after song ends. The great towers of Bayon still watched in all four directions. The library still stood, though unread. The bridges still arched across dry moats. Even when ceremonies ceased, the intention behind them remained etched into stone. And in this absence, a new kind of reverence emerged, one no longer dependent on priests or scripts, but on presence. Travelers who came centuries later often described the ruins as haunted, but not by fear. Haunted by peace. Haunted by meaning too vast to be fully grasped. They found no priest yet felt watched. No music, yet heard rhythm. No prayers, yet sensed sanctity. The temples once alive with human voices had begun to speak in a different tongue, quiet, patient, elemental. Theravada Buddhism, which gradually became the spiritual lifeblood of Cambodia, brought with it a different approach. It asked for no grand monuments, no celestial hierarchy. It turned inward toward simplicity, toward mindfulness. And so while the old temples were no longer maintained as royal shrines, they were not discarded. Instead, they were visited by wandering monks, by farmers, bringing rice, by children with curious eyes. Rituals did not vanish. They changed shape. One can still find candles lit at the foot of broken lintels, still see saffron robes draped gently across weathered statues, still hear the murmured verses of the Dhammapada whispered beneath lintel stones blackened by centuries. The silence that replaced the ancient ceremonies is not an absence of faith, it is its evolution. Not a forgetting, but a soft remembering carried by fewer voices, but no less sacred. This quiet reverence is in many ways more powerful than spectacle. It asks for no applause, it expects no witness. A single monk sitting in meditation among the ruins may say more than 1,000 trumpets. A faded lotus blossom left in a cracked niche may carry more intention than an entire royal decree. In silence, meaning distills. In stillness, the sacred condenses. And still, nature participates. The breeze flows through broken galleries like breath through a flute. Light pours across moss-covered carvings like ceremonial oil. Rain falls on stone with the cadence of an old hymn. The elements become the new officiants. The sky, the forest, the rain, they now perform the liturgy once sung by men. The divine has not left, it has merely changed its voice. There is no schedule to these ceremonies now, no calendar to mark holy days, and yet each moment in Angkor feels sacred. The morning mist that rises over the towers of Preah Khan, the moonlight that rests on Tasum's collapsed Gopura, the dragonflies that dance above the reflection pools of Neak Peen. These are the rituals that remain, not organized, not codified, but real. Perhaps it is only in silence that we can truly hear what the past is trying to say. Words can distract, dramas can deceive, but stone does not lie, it endures. And through it, Angkor continues to speak not of conquest, not of collapse, but of continuity, of the sacred made quiet, of the holy made humble. Angkor's ceremonies may have ended, but its sanctity did not. And perhaps in this soft afterlife of silence, it has found a purer form of worship, one not tied to power, nor to empire, but to awe.
The empire fell, but its spirit still breathes in every stone.
Beneath the shade of tangled banyan trees and carpets of moss, the stones of Angkor still whisper. Not with voices, of course, but with stories etched in relief, worn smooth by centuries of wind, rain, and silence. If you walk slowly without hurry and look with care, You'll find 1,000 tiny echoes trapped in the curves of a dancer's hand, in the crack of a fallen lintel, in the direction a lion's face still stares. The stones do not speak loudly. They never did. But they remember everything. Each carving on the temple walls was more than decoration, it was scripture in stone. These were the sacred texts of a civilization without bound books, where kings recorded their victories in cosmologies, not in libraries but in architecture. You can trace entire mythologies along gallery walls, battles between gods and demons, the churning of the cosmic ocean, the trials of Rama and Sita. And yet, even beyond the divine, there are the subtle, almost human scenes, a child feeding a bird, a woman with a lotus blossom tucked behind her ear, a guard pausing mid-step as though he too heard something rustle in the jungle. Many inscriptions remain carved in ancient Khmer and Sanskrit, now cracked, but not erased. Some speak of kings and donors of gifts to temples and the building of bridges. Others list rice fields and slaves' ceremonial robes, and elephants given in tribute. They seem mundane at first: inventory lists, legal declarations, but within them lies the heartbeat of Angkor, the record of daily life woven into the divine. These stones catalog not only gods but people, not only eternity but seasons, rains, and taxes. There is grief carved into these temples too, not loudly, but you can see it in unfinished bas-reliefs left abandoned mid-story in statues with missing heads in walls that lean as if too tired to hold memory upright any longer. Some sections show signs of hasty construction, as if built under pressure or redesigned in a moment of upheaval. Others bear signs of vandalism, not modern, but ancient, where new regimes defaced old deities. Even in a city of gods, politics left its scars. The most enduring whispers, however, are not in the carvings, but in the space between them. In doorways where no one walks, in stairs worn smooth by millions of feet now empty, in the places where ritual once rang out loud, and now only wind moves. Silence fills the same corridors that once carried chants. And that silence has texture. It is not emptiness, but echo. Some say the stones breathe. Not literally, of course, but they seem to shift in mood with the light. At dawn, they glow soft and pink, like memory stirred awake. At noon, they glare with certainty, shadow sharp. And by dusk, they retreat again into secrecy. The temples are never quite the same place twice. They do not reveal themselves easily. You must return again and again. Modern archaeologists have uncovered much floor plans, water systems, lost shrines buried beneath newer temples. But even they confess that what remains unknown still outweighs what is understood. For every inscription translated, there are 10 more weathered beyond reading. For every layout revealed, there are theories still debated. Angkor remains a riddle not because it refuses to answer, but because its answers are layered in centuries of dust and reverence. There's a curious humility in walking through these ruins. You begin with questions, grand ones often about gods and empires and forgotten kings. But as you walk, the questions become smaller, more human. Who stood here, barefoot on this same stone? What were they thinking? What prayers were whispered in that corner, now lost to vines? And strangely, it is those small questions that stay with you longest. Even broken, the temples still guide. Their symmetry is profound alignments with stars, with solstices, with cardinal directions. Their proportions still follow sacred geometry, derived from ancient Hindu and Buddhist cosmology. There is a wisdom in these layouts that speaks not just to devotion, but to understanding. To build something that points to the heavens, you must first understand the earth beneath your feet. In places where roofs have collapsed, you see the sky where once there was ceiling. Sunlight pours into sanctuaries now open to rain. And in those places, one feels strangely welcome. Not as a tourist, not even as a guest, but as something else, an echo perhaps of all who came before. The stones do not ask you to worship, but they invite you to listen. For centuries, the people of Cambodia have come to these temples not only as heritage sites, but as sacred ground. Weddings are blessed near basins once used for ritual bathing. Monks meditate where once kings made offerings. Children chase each other where sacred processions marched. In this continuity, the stones gain new life. They are not relics, they are vessels. The whisper of the stones changes depending on who listens. To the historian, they tell of empires and timelines. To the artist, they speak in texture and form. To the pilgrim, they hum with holiness. And to the wanderer with open eyes and quiet steps, they speak of time not as a line, but as a breath of presence that lingers. The great mystery of Angkor is not why it fell. Civilizations rise and collapse, that is the way of history. The mystery is why, even in collapse, it never truly died. Why the stones, weathered and broken, still pull us in. Why we kneel before them without knowing why. Why we listen as if some echo might yet speak. History, like a manuscript, is rarely preserved whole. Pages are torn margins, smudged lines faded by the weather of centuries. And when it comes to the Khmer Empire, some of the most critical pages are missing entirely. We know the names of kings who raised stone towers to the sky, but not always how they died. We see the grandeur of Angkor's temples, but cannot always trace the hearts of the people who worshipped within them. There are holes in the story, and they are as haunting as they are instructive. Why does so little remain of Khmer literature, despite such a rich artistic culture? The empire carved its faith in history into stone, but wrote its language on palm leaves, fragile, flammable, ephemeral. Fires, humidity, war, and time devoured the archives. Very few manuscripts have survived, and those that did are often incomplete or transcribed centuries later from oral memory. What was once a vibrant intellectual life with court poets, philosophers, and scribes has become a soft echo barely heard beneath the roar of ruins. The Khmer Empire left behind no Herodotus, no official chronicler to record its days in flowing verse or detailed prose. We must piece the past together from inscriptions, foreign accounts, and archaeological guesswork. Chinese emissaries and travelers from Jai Viet wrote of Angkor in glimpses, fragments filtered through the lens of diplomacy and misunderstanding. These records are valuable, but they are mirrors, not windows. We see Angkor's reflection, not its voice. Among the most confounding mysteries is the abruptness of certain transitions. We know that Theravada Buddhism replaced the dominant Hindu-Buddhist syncretism at the heart of royal worship. But how did this unfold socially? Was it peaceful or turbulent? Were entire priestly classes displaced? Were temples reconsecrated quietly? Or did they fall to disuse before being claimed anew? These questions have no clear answers, only suppositions built from the silent stones and the faint trails of culture that remain. And then there are the people, the millions who lived, worked, prayed, farmed, and built across centuries of Khmer rule. Their names were rarely carved in stone. They appear as figures in bas-reliefs, carrying offerings, rowing boats, building walls, but their stories, aspirations, and fears are largely lost. We do not know what lullabies were sung in the wooden houses outside Angkor Thom. We do not know what gossip passed through the marketplaces. We cannot read the love letters or deathbed prayers. These missing pages are not about kings, they're about humanity. Even the chronology of the empire remains debated. Some rulers' reigns are poorly dated. Certain temples are difficult to attribute. Scholars argue about whether Yayavarman IV was a usurper or reformer. The capital was relocated more than once, but was it due to war, drought, ambition, or all of the above? Each theory competes with the others like vines tangled over a broken statue. The past does not resist being known. It simply asks for patience, humility, and imagination. In recent decades, lighter technology has helped fill some of these blanks. By using laser scanning to pierce the jungle canopy, archaeologists have uncovered vast urban grids, roads, reservoirs, neighborhoods once hidden beneath centuries of forest growth. These discoveries reveal that Angkor was not simply a religious center, but a living metropolis, one of the largest pre-industrial cities in the world. But for all that we can now see, the voices of its inhabitants remain missing. What did the fall of Angkor feel like to those who stayed behind? What was the emotional texture of decline? Did people cling to rituals even as the roads crumbled? Or did they quietly adapt, shifting their homes and prayers elsewhere without ever marking the moment of change? The collapse of an empire for most people is not a single dramatic event. It is a slow fading like sunlight at the end of the day, so gradual you don't notice until the stars are out. There's also the question of how Khmer culture was remembered or forgotten by later generations. For centuries, Angkor was absorbed into legend. The temples became sites of pilgrimage, yes, but also mystery. Local stories grew around them. Myths of giants, Naga serpents, divine architects. In a way, the absence of historical records created room for imagination. The void left by missing pages was filled with poetry, dreams, and wonder. Modern Cambodia has made great efforts to reclaim its historical narrative. Scholars and monks, artists and educators have worked to preserve what can be salvaged and to celebrate what endures. Yet the missing pages remain an ache, an awareness that something vast was once written here and now survives only in fragments. It is an inheritance of beauty and absence, of knowing and not knowing. But perhaps this is what makes Angkor timeless. The silence of its lost records invites each generation to read it anew. Each visitor becomes a translator, interpreting the whispers of stone through their own imagination. Each question without answer becomes a doorway and opening, not to certainty, but to wonder. And in this way, the missing pages do not only mark a loss, they create a space, a sacred silence that keeps the past alive. In the quiet of dawn, when the first golden rays strike the towers of Angkor, Wat Cambodia wakes not only to a new day, but to a reflection of its soul. These stones, carved 1,000 years ago now, form the foundation of a nation's identity. The temples are no longer only relics of the past. They are symbols of survival, pride, and cultural rebirth. What was once an imperial capital veiled by jungle has become a beating heart etched on the national flag, the currency, and in the collective memory of a people who endured the near erasure of their own history. The 20th century was unkind to Cambodia. Colonization, civil war, genocide, and cultural loss scarred the country deeply. But amid this suffering, Angkor endured, sometimes neglected, sometimes looted, yet always present. When Pol Pot's regime sought to erase memory and identity, they could not erase the silhouette of Angkor Wat. The temple's silent yet unyielding became a quiet resistance. Even as books were burned and traditions suppressed, the image of Angkor lingered on old postcards, in whispers and exile dreams. It is no accident that Cambodia chose Angkor Wat for its flag, the only country in the world to feature a temple as its national symbol. More than architecture, it is a declaration we are still here. The Khmer Empire may have fallen, but the spirit that raised Angkor's towers remains. That choice is not merely nostalgic, it is aspirational. It reminds the world and Cambodians themselves that greatness is not behind them, but within them, waiting again to rise. Tourism helped revive this connection. In the 1990s, as Cambodia slowly emerged from conflict, the global fascination with Angkor rekindled domestic pride. Millions arrived to see the temples, marvel at their scale, and trace the outlines of a civilization they barely understood. For Cambodians, many of whom had never visited Angkor before, it became a pilgrimage, a rediscovery of self. Children learned not just about temples, but about their ancestors. Farmers who once viewed the ruins as just old stone now saw them as sacred heritage. A national narrative began to regrow from the ruins. Yet the rebirth of Angkor and Cambodia's identity is not only about monuments, it is about language, dance, belief, and belonging. Classical Khmer dance, once nearly extinguished, began to flourish again, its gestures drawn from temple reliefs. Traditional music, monastic life, and crafts returned not as museum pieces, but as living practices. The temples provided the scripts, and the people breathed life into them. In reclaiming Angkor, Cambodia reclaimed its voice. This revival was not without challenges. Land disputes, over-tourism, looting, and political manipulation threatened the integrity of both the site and its meaning. Some saw Angkor only as economic opportunity, a backdrop for luxury hotels and commercial shows. Others worried that conservation efforts, while necessary, risked alienating local communities. But amid these tensions, grassroots efforts emerged: artists, monks, scholars, and villagers, working not for profit but for preservation. They understood that Angkor's true power lay not in stone, but in the spirit it awakened. Education became a bridge between past and present. Schools began teaching the history of the Khmer Empire, not just as dates and names, but as legacy. Students learned about Jayavarman VII alongside modern Cambodian heroes. Exhibitions, documentaries, and books helped the diaspora reconnect with their roots. Even abroad, Cambodian communities began celebrating their heritage through Angkor. The temples became symbols of pride, not pain. For the younger generation, Angkor is both a mystery and a mirror. They grow up seeing it on their money, their school books, and their festivals. And yet every visit reveals something new: a carved smile in Bayon, a crack in a pillar, a story their grandparents only half remembered. This tension between familiarity and discovery keeps the connection alive. Angkor is not frozen, it evolves. It becomes personal. Religion, too, plays a role. Though built as a Hindu and later Buddhist center, Angkor now serves many spiritual functions. Monks meditate in quiet corners. Offerings are left beneath Bodhi trees. Some locals believe the stones still hold sacred energy. Others see them as ancestral protectors. This quiet spiritual continuity, unbroken even by centuries of abandonment, binds the past and present in a way politics never could. The global stage also amplified Angkor's symbolic power. When UNESCO declared it a World Heritage Site, it was more than a protective label, it was international acknowledgement of Khmer brilliance. The temples no longer belonged only to Cambodia, but to the world. And yet for Cambodians, this recognition affirms something deeper, that their ancestors' achievements mattered not just in textbooks, but in the global human story. But perhaps the most poignant aspect of Angkor's rebirth is its emotional resonance. For a country that has suffered so much, the temples offer more than history, they offer healing. Standing beneath the towers of Angkor, what many Cambodians feel not only awe, but solace. The stones, weathered and patient, seem to whisper, "You've endured. You are not broken." In their endurance, the temples lend quiet strength to a people who have learned to rebuild from ashes. There is still much work to be done. Preservation is ongoing, education is uneven. Not all Cambodians have access to the richness of their own heritage, but the seed is planted. The narrative has shifted from ruin to resilience. Angkor is no longer just what is, and what can be. It is memory reclaimed and future imagined. As the sun sets behind the western entrance of Angkor Wat, casting long shadows across its stone causeway, one cannot help but feel the breath of time itself. Not heavy, not tragic, but steady, present, alive. In that light, Angkor stands not as a tomb of the past, but as a bridge. From empire to nation, from silence to story, from loss to meaning. History rarely stands still. Like the jungle vines that coil through Angkor's towers, it grows twists and sometimes distorts what it covers. Today, as tourists pose before sunrise at Angkor Wat, and school children memorize the names of ancient kings, a question lingers beneath the admiration: what parts of the Khmer Empire are facts, and what parts are the stories we've told ourselves to fill the gaps? Are we remembering a civilization, or are we rebuilding a myth from scattered stones and national longing? It's not a cynical question. Myths are not lies, they are meanings. They help nations make sense of themselves. For Cambodia, the Khmer Empire is a golden thread running through a fabric that was once nearly torn apart. It offers identity, inspiration, and a sense of deep time. But when symbols become sacred, history can become selective. In honoring the glory, we risk forgetting the complexity. Take Angkor Wat itself, a structure of unmatched elegance and scale. Most believe it was a temple of devotion, but it was also a political message carved in sandstone. Its very orientation, its bas-reliefs, and its symmetry were declarations of power as much as piety. And yet in modern retellings, it often becomes simply a wonder of faith or a mystery of engineering. We marvel at its survival, but forget the human ambition and conflict behind its creation. Popular media adds layers of fantasy. Films, novels, and travel documentaries describe Angkor as a lost city in the jungle, discovered by accident, as if Cambodians themselves had forgotten it. This colonial-era myth, first spread by French explorers and romanticized by Western audiences, paints the Khmer as ghosts of their own greatness. In truth, locals never forgot Angkor. They worshipped, they lived nearby, told stories, and protected it in ways that modern archaeology still doesn't fully understand. Even the phrase Khmer Empire is a simplification. What we call an empire was in many ways a constellation of shifting powers, alliances, religious influences, and rivalries. Kings ruled over an intricate network of elites, temples, farmers, and spiritual advisors, not an unbroken monolith. The idea of a glorious, unified Khmer Golden Age is partly real, partly imagined, partly remembered through the lens of 20th century nationalism. That doesn't make it less meaningful, only more human. There is beauty in these myths, but also danger. When history is frozen into a single heroic narrative, we lose the voices of those who didn't fit that mold. What about the women of Angkor, the dancers, healers, scribes, and queens who appear in carvings but rarely in textbooks? What of the Cham, the Thai, the Lao, and the indigenous hill peoples who interacted with or resisted the empire? These stories are threads too, but they're often left outside the national tapestry. Scholars today walk a delicate line. On one hand, they seek evidence, radiocarbon dates, inscriptions, soil samples. On the other, they know that communities around Angkor hold their own truths passed down in oral traditions, folk legends, and ritual practices. These may not always match the archaeological record, but they are records of a different kind, records of emotional memory, of sacred time, of lived experience. The challenge then is not to dismiss myth, but to understand what it does. It's not about disproving the idea of a god-king or questioning the greatness of Angkor. It's about peeling back the layers of how and why we remember what we do. It's about being curious. Why do we venerate some kings more than others? Why do we fixate on certain temples? What makes one ruin a monument and another a forgotten pile of stones? Even the decline of Angkor has been mythologized. For years, the dominant story was one of sudden collapse of an empire, abandoned, swallowed by jungle, forgotten. New research tells a more nuanced story, a gradual transformation, adaptation, decentralization. Angkor didn't fall in a day. It evolved even as climate stress, warfare, and shifting trade routes redefined the region. But the myth of collapse is more cinematic, more dramatic, and so it sticks. This process isn't unique to Cambodia. All great civilizations are filtered through the lens of later generations. Egypt becomes the land of pyramids and pharaohs. Rome, the cradle of law and empire. The Maya, a culture of calendars and prophecy. In each case, the messy, contradictory, deeply human aspects are often pushed aside to make room for clearer, more digestible stories. The Khmer Empire is no different. It is at once a reality and a reflection. Still, memory evolves, and in Cambodia today, a new kind of remembering is taking shape, one that balances reverence with inquiry. Universities in Phnom Penh and Siem Reap are producing homegrown archaeologists, historians, and anthropologists. Community projects record village oral histories. Artists reinterpret Angkor through painting, sculpture, and film, not to freeze the past, but to engage with it. This is living memory, not static myth. The role of Angkor in political narratives cannot be overlooked. Leaders have invoked its image to unify, to legitimize, even to distract. The temples have appeared in campaign posters, public speeches, and military parades. At times, the grandeur of the past is used to obscure the challenges of the present. This is not unique to Cambodia, but it raises a question: is the empire a mirror or a mask? For many Cambodians, especially, the young Angkor is both inheritance and inspiration. It is not merely something to be proud of, but something to learn from. The symmetry of the temples, the engineering of the berets, the art of the apsaras. These are not dead relics. They are sparks. They suggest that Cambodian civilization was not only great, but ingenious, layered, and full of vision. That same potential exists now, waiting to be rekindled. The diaspora plays a role too. Cambodians living abroad often return to Angkor with a different gaze, not as tourists, but as seekers of roots. For some, it is a place of healing, a way to reconcile with a past fractured by war and exile. For others, it is a place of questioning: how do we honor the past without turning it into a pedestal too high to reach? How do we embrace identity without clinging to illusion? Technology adds yet another layer. Virtual reconstructions, drone footage, interactive maps, they make Angkor more accessible than ever before, but they also risk flattening its mystery. A 3D model cannot replicate the stillness of standing before a 1,000-year-old tower, the smell of incense, the flicker of candlelight on stone. In digitizing the empire, we must be careful not to sanitize it. The ruins must still be allowed to speak in silence. So, myth or memory? The answer is both and neither fully. Angkor lives in that liminal space between what was and what we wish had been. It is a symbol that changes depending on who looks and when and why. That's not a flaw. That's the nature of heritage. It is not just something we inherit, it is something we shape. To stand at Angkor today is to face not only stone, but story, a story still unfolding. With each new generation, the meaning of the empire shifts, gains new contours, sheds old ones. The myths evolve, the memory deepens. And in that ever-turning wheel, the Khmer Empire is not lost. It is remembered, reimagined, reborn. The empire is gone, but its whispers still shape the world. The Khmer Empire was never just a kingdom. It was never only about stone towers and majestic kings. It was a belief system sculpted into the earth, a cosmic map made of bricks, water, and devotion. When we look at Angkor, we are not simply witnessing architecture. We are witnessing memory frozen in sandstone and slowly thawing under the warmth of modern eyes. Over the last few hours, we've walked through forgotten canals, stood beneath god-kings, traced the lives of monks, builders, farmers, and queens. We've listened to the silence that followed the empire's fall and heard how that silence was never truly empty. Through ruins and rivers, we've uncovered more than just history. We've uncovered how the past continues to shape identity, power, and hope. Angkor is not just what remains, it is what remembers. Because this empire, this civilization, is more than a page in a book. It is a question written in stone, a reminder that greatness is not measured in how loudly you rise, but in how deeply you endure. The Khmer Empire endured not only in physical form, but in the hearts of those who rebuilt their stories from whispers, myths, and prayers. It lives in Cambodian songs and rituals in temple shadows at dusk. It lives where memory refuses to die. So now we leave you with a question. If Angkor Wat was built for gods, then what in this world is built for us, the seekers of meaning, the listeners of stories, the travelers into the past? Are we just observers, or are we also keepers? What do we choose to remember, and what do we leave buried beneath the roots? We invite you to reflect. Have you ever stood before the towers of Angkor at sunrise, felt the warmth of the stone, heard the quiet weight of centuries? If so, what moved you most? The grandeur, the silence, the mystery? And if you haven't, what would you expect to find there? A monument or a mirror? What do you believe makes a civilization truly great? Is it the scale of its temples, the power of its kings, the reach of its conquests? Or is it something quieter, how it treated its people, how it connected with the sacred, how it left behind a legacy of harmony or hubris? There is no single answer, only echoes, only what we're willing to listen to. Let us know in the comments what resonated most with you. Share your thoughts, your questions, your wonderings. Perhaps you visited Angkor, perhaps you dreamed too. Either way, your voice adds to this ongoing story, a story that continues to unfold with every curious mind, every open heart. Thank you for walking with us through the jungles of time, through gods and waters, dancers and dynasties. This has not only been a history, it has been a journey into the soul of an empire, and maybe even a quiet step closer to understanding our own. Until next time, may the roots part gently beneath your feet, and may the echoes of Angkor whisper softly in your thoughts. See you in the next story.